Throughout the annals of American history, few collections of coincidences have captured the public imagination quite like the remarkable parallels between the assassinations of President Abraham Lincoln and President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Two leaders separated by nearly a century, yet connected by an extraordinary web of uncanny similarities that continue to perplex historians and casual observers alike. Abraham Lincoln was elected to the presidency in 1860, while John Kennedy was elected exactly 100 years later in 1960, a mathematical alignment that immediately strikes observers as improbable, though of course elections occur on regular 4-year cycles, making this less remarkable than it initially appears. Both presidents were deeply concerned with civil rights and the advancement of marginalized populations within American society, Lincoln during the era of slavery and Reconstruction, while Kennedy during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Both men were assassinated while in office, Lincoln shot in Ford's Theater in 1865 and Kennedy shot in Dallas, Texas in 1963, and both were succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson, Andrew Johnson and Lyndon B. Johnson, respectively. The similarities extend further into the peculiar details of their deaths, as Lincoln was shot in the back of the head while seated, and Kennedy was also shot while seated in a vehicle, both incidents occurring in public settings where crowds had gathered. Both assassins, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, were themselves killed before standing trial, preventing full legal proceedings from concluding in either case. Booth fled to a warehouse where he was cornered and shot, while Oswald was shot by nightclub owner Jack Ruby while in police custody. The psychological mechanism behind our fascination with these parallels likely stems from the human brain's remarkable capacity for pattern recognition, a survival mechanism evolved over millennia to help us identify threats and understand our environment, which can become overactive when we examine historical data and begin to see connections that may be partly coincidental rather than causally related. We are naturally drawn to narratives of order and meaning, and when presented with genuine similarities alongside more tenuous connections, our minds weave them into compelling stories that feel significant and portentous. The persistence of this particular collection of parallels in popular culture and historical discussion reveals something deeper about how we process historical information and construct meaning from complex sets of facts. Despite the logical recognition that many of these parallels could occur by chance, or that some alleged similarities are exaggerated or misremembered, the Lincoln-Kennedy narrative endures in our collective consciousness as a fascinating coincidence that reminds us of both the unpredictability of history and the human drive to find order within apparent randomness. Yet this inclination to connect disparate historical events through pattern matching also serves an important function in how we engage with history itself, prompting us to ask critical questions about causation, coincidence, and the narratives we construct to make sense of tragedy and loss. In the year 1898, 14 years before the actual sinking of the RMS Titanic, an American author named Morgan Robertson published a novella titled Futility, which told the story of an enormous British passenger ship called the SS Titan that struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean and sank with tremendous loss of life due to an insufficient number of lifeboats aboard the vessel. The parallels between Robertson's fictional account and the historical tragedy that would unfold in 1912 are so remarkably precise that the coincidence has captivated researchers, skeptics, and believers in the paranormal for over a century, generating countless theories about precognition, unconscious prophecy, and the mysterious nature of human intuition. The similarities are genuinely striking when examined closely. Both ships were considered unsinkable by their creators and operators. Both were among the largest vessels of their respective eras. Both were British registered or British owned. Both struck icebergs on their maiden or near-maiden voyages in the North Atlantic. Both sank in April. Both carried an inadequate number of lifeboats relative to their passenger capacity, and both resulted in thousands of deaths among the wealthy and middle-class travelers aboard. Robertson's fictional Titan was approximately 800 tons, while the actual Titanic was approximately 46,000 tons, and his ship carried approximately 1,000 passengers, while the real ship carried approximately 2,200. Yet these numerical differences seem almost inconsequential when faced with the overwhelming specificity of the other details. The logical explanation for this phenomenon rests primarily upon the idea of informed speculation rather than genuine precognition, as Robertson was a knowledgeable maritime writer who understood contemporary ship design, understood the growing trend toward larger vessels, understood the economics of transatlantic travel, and could reasonably extrapolate what dangers might befall such a vessel given the known hazards of the North Atlantic shipping routes. Ships had struck icebergs before Robertson wrote his novella, and maritime experts were already aware of the iceberg danger that existed in certain regions and seasons, making it a logical hazard for any fiction writer to incorporate into a cautionary tale about the hubris of human engineering. The inadequate lifeboat situation was not unique to Robertson's imagination either, as this was already a recognized problem in maritime safety discussions of the era, with critics and safety advocates having raised concerns about whether modern ships were carrying enough lifeboats for their growing passenger capacities. What remains peculiar, however, is that despite knowing the logical foundations for this coincidence, we continue to regard it with an almost supernatural reverence, treating Robertson's novella as though it represents something beyond mere educated guessing or statistical probability. And this tendency reveals something fundamental about human psychology and our relationship with causality and fate itself. Perhaps we are drawn to such coincidences because they offer a comforting illusion of predictability in an uncertain world, suggesting that catastrophes might be foreseen and prevented if only we possessed sufficient wisdom or sensitivity to read the signs that history whispers to us in advance. In the years preceding September 11, 2001, there existed a peculiar pattern within aviation training circles that would later seem impossibly prescient to those examining the historical record. Flight instructors across the United States reported a notable increase in foreign nationals, particularly those from the Middle East and South Asia, enrolling in advanced pilot training programs with a singular and unusual focus that distinguished them from typical aviation students. These individuals consistently expressed intense interest in learning how to operate large commercial aircraft, yet remarkably, many showed little concern with the fundamental skills of takeoff and landing, instead directing their educational focus almost exclusively toward the mechanics of in-flight maneuvering and the operation of aircraft systems at cruise altitude. Several flight schools documented concerns about students who requested unusual training parameters, such as how to disable communication systems or the specific weight distribution and structural vulnerabilities of Boeing 737 aircraft, requests that seemed entirely disconnected from legitimate commercial aviation pursuits. One particularly notable incident involved an instructor who became so alarmed by a student's singular focus on how to pilot a large aircraft into a building that he reported the individual to the Federal Bureau of Investigation months before the attacks would occur. The mechanism underlying this historical coincidence operates through the lens of pattern recognition and hindsight bias, wherein our minds naturally construct narratives of connection and foreshadowing when examining past events with the knowledge of their outcomes firmly established in our consciousness. We unconsciously reframe ordinary, albeit suspicious, behavior through the devastating lens of what would eventually transpire, transforming ambiguous warning signs into what appears to be a clear and obvious prediction. What makes this particular coincidence so persistently unsettling is not merely that warnings existed, but rather that they existed within institutional systems designed specifically to identify and prevent such threats, and yet they moved through bureaucratic channels slowly enough that action could not be taken in time, leaving us to contemplate the fragile intersection between information, institutional response, and catastrophic consequence. Additional sentences. The Phoenix memo, filed by an FBI agent in Arizona warning of suspicious flight training activity, languished in bureaucratic limbo while similar reports from flight schools in Minnesota and New Jersey similarly failed to coalesce into actionable intelligence before the attacks occurred. In this sense, the tragedy represents not a failure of individual vigilance, but rather a systemic breakdown in information synthesis, a reminder that prescient warnings, however specific, remain meaningless without the institutional mechanisms to transform them into timely prevention. Samuel Clemens, known to the world as Mark Twain, was born on November 30, 1835, during the appearance of Halley's Comet, a celestial visitor that returns to Earth's orbit approximately every 76 years in a cosmic cycle as predictable as the seasons themselves. On April 21, 1910, at the age of 74, Mark Twain died, and on that very same night, Halley's Comet reached its closest point to Earth during its return to the inner solar system, completing a full orbital journey and arriving back at the precise moment when the man who had entered the world during its last passage departed from it. The synchronicity of these two events, separated by more than 7 decades, created a narrative so compelling that it seemed to defy the laws of probability, as if the universe had conspired to bookend a human life with the arrival and departure of an ancient wanderer from the depths of space. Twain himself had recognized this remarkable alignment and had even joked about it in his final years, famously declaring that he had come in with the comet and would go out with the comet, as if he possessed some intimate connection with the celestial body that transcended the mere coincidence of calendar dates. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep human tendency to find meaning in patterns, especially when those patterns intersect with significant life events, transforming mathematical probability into what feels like destiny or cosmic intention. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, evolved to notice correlations because in ancient environments, recognizing patterns meant survival, yet this same mechanism causes us to see meaningful connections even in random events, creating what statisticians call apophenia, the human compulsion to perceive meaningful patterns within random data. We have normalized this particular coincidence into popular culture and educational discourse, repeating it as fact in biographies and documentaries without adequate reflection on how our retelling of the story reinforces its sense of inevitability, transforming what is statistically unremarkable into something that feels cosmically significant simply through the power of narrative and repetition. Yet Twain's story remains compelling precisely because it invites us to examine this paradox. Even as we understand the cognitive mechanisms that make us susceptible to such narratives, we find ourselves unable to fully resist their emotional pull, suggesting that our hunger for meaningful connection to the cosmos may serve a psychological purpose that transcends rational analysis. Perhaps this is why Twain's life has become a kind of modern myth, not despite our understanding of its statistical ordinariness, but because it exemplifies how humans transform the ordinary into the extraordinary through the act of storytelling itself, reminding us that meaning, whether cosmic or constructed, shapes how we understand our place in an indifferent universe. And indeed, when we consider how Twain spent his final decades writing about mortality, regret, and humanity's place in an uncaring cosmos, we recognize that his life's work had already prepared us to receive this ending not as mere coincidence, but as a kind of literary punctuation mark, a closing parenthesis that validated everything he had written about the human condition. On the 28th of June in 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie were traveling through Sarajevo in an open-topped automobile as part of an official visit to the Austro-Hungarian territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a region that had been annexed just 6 years prior and remained a source of considerable tension among Serbian nationalists who viewed Austrian rule as an occupying force that prevented their dreams of a unified South Slavic state. The motorcade followed a predetermined route through the city streets, with security measures that were remarkably sparse by modern standards, consisting largely of local police and a handful of military personnel who were distributed somewhat haphazardly along the planned path. Earlier that morning, a group of Bosnian Serb assassins positioned themselves at various points along the route, armed with pistols and bombs, waiting for their opportunity to strike at the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne whom they saw as a symbol of imperial oppression. The first assassination attempt occurred when one conspirator threw a bomb that bounced off the car and exploded beneath the vehicle behind it, injuring several people but missing Franz Ferdinand himself. Rather than returning to the safety of his residence, the Archduke decided to visit the wounded officers in the hospital, which necessitated a change in the motorcade's route through the city. Due to miscommunication between the driver and the security detail, the automobile carrying Franz Ferdinand made a wrong turn onto a side street called Apel Key. And as fate would have it, this unexpected detour brought the open car directly in front of a young Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip, who had become separated from the other conspirators after the failed bomb attack and had been standing on that very corner in a state of dejection about the failed mission. Princip could hardly believe his extraordinary luck as the vehicle slowed to a stop just meters away from where he stood, placing the Archduke and his wife within point-blank range. He drew his Browning pistol and fired twice at close range, killing both Ferdinand and Sophie in what would become one of the most consequential assassinations in human history. The psychological mechanism at work in this coincidence rests upon the collision between meticulous planning and chaotic circumstance, where months of careful coordination by the assassins were rendered almost irrelevant by a simple navigational error that placed their target directly before one of their own members who had abandoned hope of success just moments before. The driver's mistake, the decision to visit the hospital, the particular route chosen as an alternative, and Princip's position on that specific street corner all converged in a way that seemed almost scripted by some invisible hand orchestrating events toward an inevitable conclusion. This assassination triggered a chain reaction of diplomatic crises and military mobilizations that would ultimately plunge Europe into the First World War, a conflict that would reshape the political landscape of the entire continent and claim millions of lives. In the heart of Samarkand, Uzbekistan, there stands a mausoleum of considerable architectural significance, the final resting place of Timur, known to history as Tamerlane, the great Turco-Mongol conqueror who swept across Central Asia and the Middle East in the 14th century, leaving behind a legacy of unprecedented destruction and conquest. Within this tomb, sealed for centuries beneath layers of stone and tradition, rested the mortal remains of this legendary warrior, and surrounding his burial site there accumulated, over generations, a peculiar folklore suggesting that any disturbance of his grave would precipitate catastrophic consequences, not merely for individuals, but potentially for entire nations and peoples. This legend existed in a state of dormancy for hundreds of years, passed down through oral tradition and local superstition, until the 20th century arrived with its scientific optimism and its hunger to uncover historical truths through archaeological investigation. In June of 1941, just days before Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union, Soviet archaeologists broke the seal of Tamerlane's tomb and opened his grave, conducting scientific examination of his skeletal remains and documenting their findings with meticulous academic rigor. The timing of this exhumation, occurring mere days before one of history's most devastating military invasions, created an indelible association in the minds of observers, a temporal proximity so striking that it seemed almost impossible to regard as mere coincidence. And subsequently, when the Soviet Union found itself engaged in the greatest conventional military conflict in human history, many observers began to whisper about the curse. About the supposed warning embodied in Tamerlane's grave, about the notion that disturbing the dead had unleashed catastrophe upon the land. What makes this narrative particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how it persists despite our rational understanding of causality, and despite the abundance of plausible explanations for why Germany invaded the Soviet Union that have nothing whatsoever to do with archaeological disturbance or supernatural consequence. Yet the coincidence remains lodged in cultural memory, endlessly repeated and retold, suggesting that human beings possess a profound preference for narrative causality, even when it contradicts our logical understanding of how the world operates. The curse narrative gained particular traction when the tomb was resealed in 1942, after which the Soviet forces began their dramatic reversal of fortune at Stalingrad, leading some to interpret the reburial itself as a ritualistic appeasement that restored balance to the cosmic order, though this explanation conveniently ignores the grueling military strategies and human sacrifice that actually determined the outcome of the war. The curse narrative thus serves as a compelling reminder of how humans construct meaning from randomness, how we weave explanatory threads through historical events to create coherence and agency where perhaps none exists, transforming the arbitrary brutality of war into a morality tale where ancient tombs guard cosmic justice and the dead exact vengeance upon those who violate their rest. In the labyrinthine corridors of power during the Kennedy administration, there existed a peculiar administrative detail that would later strike many observers as almost impossibly eerie in its implications. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy employed a secretary whose surname was Lincoln, a woman named Evelyn Lincoln who served as his personal secretary and executive secretary throughout his Senate career and into his presidency, maintaining one of the closest professional relationships with the young president during some of the most consequential years of American history. This seemingly mundane biographical fact would acquire an almost supernatural resonance in the collective imagination following the tragic events of November 22, 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, an occurrence that inevitably drew comparisons to another presidential assassination nearly a century earlier, when Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in 1865. The coincidence of having a secretary literally named Lincoln working for Kennedy, combined with the fact that both presidents were assassinated while in office, created a psychological framework that felt too symmetrical to be mere chance, leading many people to wonder whether history possessed some kind of underlying pattern or predetermined structure. The mechanism through which this coincidence embedded itself so deeply into cultural consciousness operates through several interconnected psychological principles that govern how humans perceive patterns and assign meaning to events. Our brains are naturally inclined toward pattern recognition, a survival mechanism that evolved to help our ancestors detect predators and environmental threats. Yet this same cognitive architecture becomes a liability when confronted with random or loosely connected events that our pattern-seeking minds desperately want to organize into coherent narratives. When Evelyn Lincoln's surname and her proximity to President Kennedy combined with the assassination itself, it created what psychologists call a clustering illusion, where our minds identify meaningful patterns in random data, thereby manufacturing significance where none objectively exists. The human consciousness seems unable to resist the gravitational pull of symmetry and narrative elegance, particularly when those patterns involve historical figures and tragic events that already carry substantial emotional weight. Furthermore, our memory operates selectively, emphasizing coincidences that confirm our pre-existing sense that the universe possesses hidden order while forgetting or dismissing the countless times we expect coincidences that never materialize. Yet despite understanding these mechanisms through which our cognition manufactures false connections, the coincidence persists as a compelling talking point in discussions of historical oddities, passed from person to person in conversations about strange patterns in history, spoken aloud in documentary series, and perpetuated through internet forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena and historical mysteries. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on a business trip for his employer, the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Company, when the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on the city, an event that would instantly kill approximately 70,000 people and ultimately claim the lives of 140,000 more by the end of that year through radiation sickness and severe burns. Yamaguchi, who was approximately 2 kilometers from the hypocenter of the explosion, was knocked down by the intense blast wave and suffered severe burns across the left side of his body, along with temporary blindness that would persist for several weeks. Yet despite these catastrophic injuries and the complete devastation surrounding him, he made the extraordinary decision to return to his hometown of Nagasaki just 3 days later. Believing that his injuries were not severe enough to warrant staying in the destroyed city. On August 9, 1945, merely 3 days after surviving the first atomic bombing in human history, Yamaguchi was standing outside his company's plant in Nagasaki when the United States dropped a second atomic bomb directly on that city, making him the only person ever conclusively documented to have survived both nuclear bombings, a distinction so statistically improbable that it seems to violate the basic laws of chance and probability. The psychological mechanism underlying this coincidence rests in the nature of survival itself and the cascading decisions that follow catastrophic events, where Yamaguchi's decision to leave Hiroshima despite his injuries represented a logical choice based on available information at the time. Yet that choice positioned him directly in the path of a second catastrophe that no reasonable person could have anticipated or predicted. What makes this coincidence particularly unsettling is how it represents the collision of personal agency with historical inevitability, where an individual's reasonable attempt to protect himself and continue his life somehow led him directly into one of history's most improbable situations. Yamaguchi survived both bombings and lived until 2010, passing away at the age of 94, and despite the extraordinary nature of his experience, he became a living testament to human resilience rather than a symbol of cosmic coincidence, as if the world had simply accepted and normalized this statistical impossibility without ever fully reckoning with its profound unlikelihood. In his later years, Yamaguchi devoted himself to peace advocacy and nuclear disarmament, traveling internationally to share his testimony and warn against the dangers of atomic weapons, transforming his unlikely survival into a moral imperative to ensure that no other person would ever face the ordeal he had endured twice. His message resonated with world leaders and ordinary citizens alike, granting his improbable survival a purpose that transcended mere statistical anomaly. He had become, against all odds, a bridge between the past's darkest moment and humanity's potential for a more peaceful future. Through his advocacy, Yamaguchi ensured that his experience would not fade into historical obscurity, but would instead serve as a perpetual reminder of nuclear weapons' incomprehensible destructive power and the urgent necessity of preventing their use ever again. In 1847, Edgar Allan Poe published a serialized novel titled The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, a dark maritime adventure tale that would become one of literature's most unsettling prophecies of real human tragedy. The story follows a young man aboard a whaling ship that encounters disaster, and in the depths of desperation and starvation, the crew members resort to an unthinkable act. They draw lots to determine which among them will be killed and consumed so that the others might survive. In the novel, a young cabin boy named Richard Parker is selected through this grim lottery, and he is killed and cannibalized by his shipmates who have become driven mad by hunger and the consuming darkness of their circumstances. What makes this narrative particularly extraordinary is that 46 years later, in 1894, a real British merchant vessel named the Mignonette sank in the South Atlantic Ocean, leaving 4 survivors clinging to a small wooden lifeboat with virtually no provisions and only minimal supplies. As days turned into weeks and their circumstances grew increasingly dire, 3 of the crew members made the horrifying decision to kill the youngest member, a 17-year-old cabin boy named Richard Parker, for the explicit purpose of consuming his body and sustaining their own lives. The probability of such specific narrative details aligning with actual historical events seems so astronomically unlikely that it has captivated the imagination of scholars, researchers, and the simply curious for generations since the discovery of this uncanny parallel. The psychological mechanism that explains why this particular coincidence achieved such lasting cultural prominence relates fundamentally to our deep human need to find patterns and meaning within randomness, especially when those patterns appear to bridge the gap between fiction and reality in ways that challenge our understanding of causality and probability. We are creatures who instinctively seek connections, and when we discover that a work of imaginative fiction shares specific details with a real tragedy, we feel a profound sense of disturbance, as though we have glimpsed evidence of some hidden order or predetermined structure underlying human events. Despite the rational knowledge that Poe could not possibly have possessed knowledge of a future maritime disaster, and despite our intellectual understanding that coincidences of this magnitude do occasionally occur through pure chance, the story persists in popular consciousness as a remarkable example of prophetic literature, and we have somehow normalized this interpretation as truth without fully examining the logical foundations upon which such claims rest. Yet this phenomenon reveals something essential about how we construct historical narratives. We cherry-pick details that confirm our desired interpretation, while conveniently overlooking the countless fictional shipwrecks, cabin boys, and survival scenarios that appeared in literature before and after Poe without manifesting in reality. A selective attention that transforms mere coincidence into seeming prophecy through the simple act of remembering only what aligns with our predetermined conclusion. In the year 2000, nearly 16 years before Donald Trump would ascend to the presidency of the United States, the animated television series The Simpsons aired an episode titled Bart to the Future, in which Lisa Simpson, having become president, inherited a nation in financial ruin from her predecessor, a character identified as President Trump. The episode depicted Trump's tenure as catastrophic, leaving the country deeply in debt and economically devastated, which Lisa would then inherit and attempt to repair through various diplomatic and fiscal measures. This remarkably specific prediction, delivered through the medium of animated comedy, would later be invoked by millions of viewers who witnessed Trump's actual election victory in 2016, prompting widespread discussion about whether the show's writers possessed some form of prescient ability, or whether they had simply extrapolated logical conclusions from observable trends in American politics and Trump's public persona at that time. The phenomenon exemplifies a common psychological pattern wherein humans search for meaning and connection in randomly distributed information, a tendency that intensifies when the predicted outcome actually occurs, causing people to retroactively assign supernatural or exceptional significance to what may have simply been an educated guess based on contemporary cultural understanding. Trump was already a prominent public figure in the year 2000, known for his real estate empire, his flamboyant lifestyle, and his controversial statements, making him a recognizable reference point for satirists who might imagine future scenarios involving wealthy, outspoken celebrities entering politics. The writers of The Simpsons, known for their satirical commentary on American society, would have possessed ample motivation and contextual awareness to imagine such a scenario without requiring any extraordinary foresight. Yet despite the logical explanations for this coincidence, the narrative persists in popular culture as evidence of something inexplicable, shared endlessly across social media platforms and discussed in countless videos and articles as though it represents genuine predictive power, demonstrating how thoroughly we have normalized the conflation of coincidence with causation, and how readily we embrace narratives that suggest hidden patterns or supernatural knowledge. Even when the mechanisms of chance and cultural observation provide entirely sufficient explanations for what we observe, this tendency reveals how readily we construct mythologies around entertainment media, transforming writers' satirical observations into oracular pronouncements, while simultaneously ignoring the countless predictions made by The Simpsons that never materialized, a selective memory that ensures the narrative of prescience persists regardless of contradictory evidence. The show's writers made predictions about countless future events, flying cars, advanced technology, political scenarios. Yet only the Trump prediction achieved cultural resonance, suggesting that our brains are fundamentally wired to remember hits and forget misses, a cognitive bias that transforms probabilistic guessing into what feels like genuine prophecy in retrospect. In the year 476 of the Common Era, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire fell from power, and his name was Romulus Augustulus, a figure whose very designation carried within it an almost impossible symmetry of historical bookending that would echo through centuries of scholarly discourse and casual observation alike. Romulus Augustulus bore a name that combined Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome itself according to ancient tradition, with Augustulus, a diminutive form of Augustus, the name of the first emperor who had established the Roman Empire centuries before, and this child emperor whose reign lasted merely 14 months found himself positioned at the exact terminus of an empire that had begun with a figure bearing a similar nomenclatural weight. The coincidence deepens when one considers that Romulus, the mythological founder, was said to have been abandoned and raised by a she-wolf, existing in poverty and obscurity before establishing Rome, while Romulus Augustulus, the final emperor, was similarly stripped of his position and removed from power, essentially abandoned by the very system that had created him, reduced to obscurity in the historical record with minimal documentation of his later life or death. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling to contemplate is how the human mind gravitates toward narrative closure and symbolic resonance, finding profound meaning in the parallelism of names and circumstances, even when such connections may be partially constructed by our own pattern-seeking tendencies rather than representing some genuine cosmic symmetry. The psychological mechanism at work involves our deep cognitive preference for stories with clear beginnings and endings, for arcs that feel complete and meaningful, and when historical events align in ways that seem too perfectly constructed to be random, we experience a peculiar satisfaction that can sometimes override our critical examination of whether such alignment possesses genuine significance or merely represents our interpretation imposed upon neutral historical facts. We have become so accustomed to accepting these narrative coincidences as meaningful that we rarely pause to question whether the empire's symbolic beginning and ending were truly orchestrated by some hidden force of history, or whether we are simply performing the ancient human act of reading meaning into the neutral sequences of events that comprise our past. And yet perhaps this interpretive act itself holds value, for in searching for meaning in Romulus Augustulus's name, we engage in the same myth-making that sustained Rome through centuries, transforming historical contingency into narrative necessity. And in doing so, we acknowledge that history is not merely what happened, but also what we choose to remember and how we choose to tell it. The name circle closes not because history demands it, but because we, as interpreters of history, possess an irresistible need to draw lines between points and call them destiny, transforming the accidental adjacency of a child emperor's nomenclature into a monument of historical inevitability that speaks more eloquently about our own hunger for meaningful patterns than it does about the Rome that actually was. In the annals of aviation history, there exists a peculiar cluster of incidents involving identical twins who both perished in separate airplane disasters, each occurrence separated by years and circumstance, yet united by an eerie biological symmetry that defies conventional probability. The most documented case involves two identical twin brothers from the United States who, despite living separate lives in different cities with different careers and different social circles, both died in commercial aircraft accidents within a span of less than a decade, each tragedy occurring under remarkably similar meteorological conditions and each involving aircraft of comparable size and vintage. The first incident occurred when one twin boarded a regional commuter flight during winter weather, and the second twin, nearly 7 years later, perished in what investigators would later describe as an almost identical scenario involving fog, mechanical failure, and a rapid descent that witnesses reported felt like the first incident replayed through time itself. What makes this particular case so unsettling to those who have studied it is not merely the coincidence of shared death, but rather the inexplicable patterns that preceded it, such as both twins having reported anxiety about flying to family members in the months before their respective deaths, both having changed their scheduled flights at the last possible moment before ultimately reboarding, and both having sat in seats within the same general fuselage section of their respective aircraft. The psychological mechanism that makes such incidents linger in our collective consciousness stems from our brain's inherent pattern recognition system, which evolved to identify threats and meaning in our environment, and when presented with data involving identical genetic material experiencing identical catastrophic outcomes, that system becomes hyperactivated, searching desperately for causal connections where none likely exist. We exist in a universe of infinite combinations and permutations, where billions of flights occur annually, where thousands of identical twins navigate the world simultaneously, and where the mathematical probability of such convergences, while extraordinarily small, is not actually impossible, yet we continue to treat these events as profound mysteries rather than statistical inevitabilities. This normalization of the extraordinary persists because our minds have become increasingly sophisticated at detecting patterns, while simultaneously remaining incapable of truly internalizing the vastness of probability and chance that governs complex systems. And so these twin tragedies continue to circulate through popular culture and true crime documentaries not as mathematical curiosities, but as harbingers of some deeper truth about destiny, genetics, and the invisible threads that bind identical twins across the spectrum of human experience. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these cases is that they remind us that identical twins represent nature's closest approximation to a controlled experiment in human destiny. And when two genetically identical individuals meet identical fates, we are forced to confront the unsettling possibility that our sense of individual agency and choice may be far more constrained by our biological inheritance than our cultural narratives of free will would comfortably allow. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, with thousands of soldiers preparing to storm the beaches of Normandy in what would become one of the defining moments of World War II. Unknown to military intelligence at the time, a seemingly innocuous crossword puzzle had appeared in the London Daily Telegraph just days before the invasion, and what made this particular puzzle so profoundly unsettling was that it contained multiple references to the operation's most closely guarded secrets, including the word Utah, which referred to one of the 5 designated beach landing zones, Omaha, referring to another critical beach sector, Sword. The code name for yet another invasion point, and perhaps most disturbing of all, Overlord, the actual operation name itself, which was classified at the highest levels of military command and known only to a select few individuals with top-secret clearance. The puzzle's constructor, Leonard Daw, was a schoolteacher and crossword compiler who had created thousands of puzzles over his career, and when military intelligence officials learned of these remarkable coincidences, they became deeply concerned that the security of the entire operation had been compromised. fearing that an enemy agent had deliberately embedded these clues into the puzzle as a signal to German forces that something significant was about to occur. The mechanism behind such a disturbing coincidence can be understood through the lens of pattern recognition and the sheer statistical probability of language itself. With thousands of possible words, hundreds of which might serve as valid crossword entries, and dozens of military code names generated during wartime, the likelihood of accidental overlap becomes less improbable when one considers the vast universe of potential combinations. Daw was thoroughly investigated by British intelligence, questioned extensively about his sources and methods, and ultimately cleared of any suspicion, though he maintained until his death that the entire situation was nothing more than the most extraordinary bad luck imaginable. What persists in this case is our deep human discomfort with randomness and coincidence, our psychological need to find meaning and intention in events that are ultimately governed by chance, and the way that wartime anxiety amplified this tendency, making military officials search for patterns that suggested enemy infiltration, when in fact they were simply confronting the strange mathematical reality that in a world filled with language and code. Some overlaps are inevitable and require no conspiratorial explanation whatsoever. This episode remains a compelling reminder that even in moments of unprecedented historical significance, we are not immune to the cognitive biases that lead us to see agency and design in innocent events, and that the reassuring clarity of hindsight often obscures the genuine uncertainty and fear that grip those tasked with protecting one of history's most vital military secrets. On December 10, 1928, Congress authorized the construction of what would become the Hoover Dam, one of the most ambitious engineering projects the world had ever undertaken, and it was during this initial congressional vote that a man named J.G. White Engineering Corporation submitted the first official bid for the massive undertaking, beginning what would become a 7-year construction process that would fundamentally alter the landscape of the American Southwest. Yet precisely 84 years later, on December 10, 2012, the very last major renovation and reinforcement project on the Hoover Dam was officially completed and opened to the public traffic once more, meaning that the dam had bookended its entire existence, from its authorization to its final significant modernization, with the exact same calendar date separated by nearly 9 decades of history. This remarkable temporal symmetry seems almost impossible to attribute to mere chance, particularly when one considers the countless variables involved in scheduling massive construction projects across nearly a century, including budget approvals, weather conditions, labor availability, and the shifting political landscapes that shaped American infrastructure priorities throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries. The human mind, evolved as it is to detect patterns and find meaning in the world around us, naturally gravitates toward such synchronicities, interpreting them as cosmic significance or evidence of some underlying design, even though the mathematical reality suggests that with enough large projects spanning enough time, such alignments become not miraculous, but inevitable and statistically expected. We have become so accustomed to searching for and finding these coincidences that we have built entire industries around pattern recognition, from numerology to data analysis, rarely pausing to acknowledge that meaningful coincidence and random occurrence wear nearly identical masks when examined closely. The Hoover Dam's first and last moments arriving on the same date stands as perhaps the most elegant example of how we assign narrative weight to events that may simply be the natural outcome of probability and time, demonstrating that even our most celebrated achievements of human engineering can become vessels for our deeper psychological need to perceive order and intentionality in a universe fundamentally governed by chance. Yet the Hoover Dam itself remains indifferent to our interpretations, standing as a monument to human capability rather than cosmic alignment, its concrete towers enduring not because of December dates, but because of the engineering precision and countless individual decisions made by workers whose names history has largely forgotten, reminding us that the most profound achievements often emerge not from fate's invisible hand, but from the determined hands of those who simply showed up to build. In this way, the Hoover Dam teaches us that what we remember about history is often less about the grand symmetries we impose upon it and more about the tangible legacy of effort itself. The electricity that still powers millions of homes, the water that still irrigates vast stretches of desert, the roads that still carry travelers across its span, all of it persisting long after we have forgotten which December dates aligned with its birth and rebirth. In the year 1865, a French author named Jules Verne published a novel titled From the Earth to the Moon, a work of speculative fiction that would later strike readers as remarkably prescient given that humanity would not actually land on the lunar surface for over 100 years. Verne's story depicted a projectile launched from Florida that would carry 3 men toward the moon, and when the Apollo 11 mission successfully landed in 1969, people began noticing extraordinary parallels between the fictional account and the actual historical event that seemed too specific to be mere coincidence. The spacecraft in Verne's novel was called the Columbiad, while the actual command module was named Columbia, a detail that struck many observers as impossible to explain through chance alone. Furthermore, Verne specified that his fictional spacecraft would weigh approximately 9,000 pounds, and the Apollo command module weighed remarkably close to this estimate, a precision that seemed to defy explanation across more than a century of technological development and cultural evolution. The mechanism underlying this apparent prophecy likely rests upon the human tendency to retrofit narratives backward after significant events have already transpired, a psychological phenomenon whereby our brains become extraordinarily skilled at recognizing patterns and connections that were never intentionally placed there by original authors. Jules Verne, writing in the 1860s, was an educated man familiar with ballistics, physics, and the scientific discussions of his era, and he would naturally gravitate toward Florida as a launch location because its geography and latitude made scientific sense for such an endeavor, not because he possessed secret knowledge of the future. The overlapping details gain their power precisely because Verne was working within the constraints of actual physics and geography, meaning that any future space program would necessarily encounter many of the same logical solutions and geographical advantages. Yet despite understanding these mechanical explanations rooted in coincidence and pattern recognition, the resonance of Verne's prediction persists in cultural memory and popular discourse, suggesting that our rational minds remain secondary to our appetite for meaning-making, even when that meaning is ultimately hollow and constructed retroactively from the raw materials of history. We construct narratives of prescience because they offer comfort in an uncertain world, transforming random alignment into evidence of underlying order, and this impulse may reveal more about our deep need for coherence than it does about Verne's actual imaginative powers. The same impulse that made Verne's century-old novel seem prophetic also explains why we remember the similarities between his vision and Apollo 11, while forgetting the countless predictions that proved entirely wrong. A selective memory that allows us to believe we inhabit a universe governed by meaningful connections rather than the indifferent churn of probability. In the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, buried beneath volcanic ash for nearly 2,000 years, the city of Pompeii preserves the final moments of an entire civilization frozen in time, and among the countless artifacts and structures that archaeologists have painstakingly uncovered, there exists a particular piece of graffiti that has haunted scholars and researchers with an almost impossible coincidence that defies rational explanation. On the walls of a building in ancient Pompeii, preserved by the very catastrophe that destroyed the city, archaeologists discovered a piece of graffiti written in Latin that appeared to reference a date. And when they carefully translated and analyzed this ancient inscription, they found that it seemed to contain what looked like a warning or notation about a year that would later prove to be extraordinarily significant in ways the original author could never have intended. The graffiti, scratched into stone by an unknown hand nearly 2 millennia ago, presented numbers and markings that some researchers began to interpret as corresponding to dates far beyond the known lifespan of the Pompeian citizen who wrote it, creating an eerie sense that someone in ancient times had somehow documented or foreshadowed events that would occur in the distant future. What makes this particular coincidence so deeply unsettling is not necessarily the graffiti itself, but rather the psychological mechanism by which we, as modern observers, project meaning onto ambiguous ancient symbols and texts, transforming innocent scratches into deliberate prophecies or warnings simply because we possess the knowledge of what came to pass. We see patterns everywhere, and when we find an ancient marking that could theoretically be interpreted as referencing a later date or event, our pattern-seeking minds immediately construct narratives around it, binding together disparate pieces of information into a seemingly intentional design when the reality is almost certainly far more mundane and explicable. Yet despite understanding this fundamental psychological tendency toward pareidolia and pattern recognition, we continue to be mesmerized by these historical coincidences, allowing them to persist in our collective cultural consciousness as though they possess some genuine prophetic quality rather than being the product of our own interpretive frameworks and confirmation biases. The graffiti of Pompeii, in this sense, becomes less a mirror of the past and more a mirror of ourselves, a reflection of our desperate human need to find meaning, connection, and hidden knowledge in the remnants of history, even when that knowledge exists only in the architecture of our own minds. In this way, the graffiti serves as a potent reminder that history is not simply something we discover, but something we continuously create and recreate through the lens of our contemporary concerns, anxieties, and desires for transcendence, making every ancient artifact a kind of Rorschach test through which we inevitably reveal more about our own era than about the civilization that left it behind. In this way, we transform Pompeii itself into a kind of historical Rorschach test, where the ambiguous scratches on its walls become screens upon which we project our modern obsessions with hidden messages, coded warnings, and the tantalizing possibility that the ancients possessed knowledge we have yet to fully comprehend. In the annals of historical coincidence, few stories encapsulate the eerie symmetry of fate quite like the tale of King Umberto I of Italy and his remarkable encounter with a stranger who bore an uncanny resemblance to his own person. On the evening of July 28, 1892, King Umberto attended a grand military review in Naples, and afterward he retired to a small restaurant to take his evening meal in relative privacy, though surrounded by his royal entourage and security detail. Upon being seated and reviewing the menu, the king glanced up from his table and found himself staring directly at the proprietor of the establishment, a man named Giovanni Giolitti, who possessed features so strikingly similar to those of the monarch himself that everyone in the room fell silent in astonishment. The resemblance was not merely passing or superficial, but rather a profound duplication of facial structure, build, and bearing that seemed to defy natural explanation, as though the universe had somehow created two versions of the same man separated by circumstance and station alone. What emerged over the course of that extraordinary evening was a series of revelations that would transform the encounter from a mere curiosity into something far more disturbing and inexplicable in its implications. Both men discovered that they had been born on the same date, shared the same name, came from remarkably similar family backgrounds, and had even chosen parallel professions within their respective stations in life. The king as a military leader and the restaurant owner as a commander of his own modest establishment. The evening concluded with the two men exchanging friendly conversation and parting ways, each marveling at the impossible nature of their connection. Yet this was merely the prologue to the tragic conclusion that would cement this story in the collective memory of history forever. Approximately 1 year later, King Umberto received word that Giovanni Giolitti, the remarkable double who had so captivated him that fateful night in Naples, had died suddenly and unexpectedly, and the king was moved to profound grief by the news, displaying an emotional reaction that seemed to transcend the normal bounds of sympathy one might show toward a stranger. Then, in a final and devastating twist of fate that appears almost too perfectly calibrated to be true, King Umberto himself was assassinated in July of 1899, precisely 7 years after his fateful meeting with his double, shot by an anarchist while riding through the streets of Monza in his carriage. The human mind, when confronted with such intricate patterns and impossible alignments, naturally searches for meaning and connection, finding in these sequences a narrative thread that suggests some deeper intelligence or purpose underlying the fabric of reality itself. Yet the truth may be far simpler and more unsettling in its implications. Our brains are pattern recognition machines par excellence, evolved to detect threats and opportunities in our environment, and this same mechanism that once kept our ancestors alive on the savannah now compels us to weave significance from random occurrences, to see design where there may only be statistical inevitability, and to construct meaning from the countless intersections that emerge when billions of lives collide across centuries of human history. In the year 1893, in the small town of Strasburg, Texas, a young man named Henry Ziegland found himself caught in the crossfire of a romantic dispute that would ultimately define the rest of his life in ways he could never have anticipated. After Henry had ended a romantic relationship with a young woman, her brother became consumed with rage and sought to exact vengeance upon him, tracking him down with a loaded revolver and firing a single shot in Henry's direction. The bullet, however, did not strike him cleanly as intended, but instead grazed his cheek and continued on its trajectory, embedding itself deeply into a nearby tree, a large pecan tree that stood as a silent witness to this moment of violence and passion. Henry survived this encounter with barely a scar, and as time passed, he gradually moved forward with his life, putting this dark chapter behind him as best he could. Many years later, in 1912, approximately 19 years after that fateful shooting, Henry Ziegland was standing beneath that same pecan tree on his property, and he made the decision to cut it down, perhaps wanting to remove this physical reminder of his brush with death. As he worked to fell the tree with an axe, the wood split open along its length, and the very same bullet that had been lodged within its trunk all those years came loose and dislodged from the wood. The projectile, now freed after nearly 2 decades of confinement, struck Henry in the head with the full force of its delayed momentum, causing injuries that ultimately proved fatal to him. This remarkable story illustrates a phenomenon that captures the human imagination like few others can, the notion that fate or destiny might operate through physical objects and time itself, that consequences can circle back upon us across years and decades in ways that seem almost deliberately orchestrated by some unseen force. The psychological appeal of this story rests partly on our deep-seated human need to find patterns and meaning in random events, to believe that actions have consequences that are not merely immediate, but can reverberate backward through time in almost supernatural ways. We are drawn to narratives where violence returns to its perpetrator, or where chance occurrences seem too perfectly timed to be mere coincidence, and this story of the bullet tree fulfills that psychological hunger completely. Yet when we examine it logically, what we are really witnessing is simply the mechanics of physics, the decomposition of wood over time, and the statistical improbability that becomes inevitable when we consider the vast scope of human history and the billions of interactions occurring constantly. We have normalized this fascination with apparent destiny while simultaneously acknowledging that no supernatural force guides the trajectory of bullets or the growth of trees, existing in a peculiar state of rational and irrational belief simultaneously. This duality in human consciousness, our ability to appreciate a story's emotional resonance while simultaneously understanding its rational explanation, may itself be the true miracle worth examining, for it reveals how we navigate a world that is simultaneously governed by blind chance and invested with profound personal meaning. On the evening of June 23, 1969, a woman named Barbara Forrest was struck by lightning while standing on her porch in South Carolina, an event that left her with severe burns across her shoulder and arm, painful injuries that required months of medical treatment and rehabilitation to overcome. 7 years later, on a seemingly ordinary afternoon in 1976, Barbara Forrest was struck by lightning a second time, an occurrence so statistically improbable that meteorologists and physicians who examined her case expressed profound astonishment, as the odds of being struck by lightning twice in a lifetime are estimated at approximately 1 in 15 million, yet she had now experienced this trauma on 2 separate occasions. The second strike occurred while she was hanging laundry in her yard, a routine domestic activity that should have been entirely unremarkable. Yet the lightning found her again with apparent inevitability, as if some inexplicable pattern had marked her for repetition of the same catastrophic event. Medical records documented that both strikes caused comparable injuries to different regions of her body, suggesting that whatever vulnerability or exposure had made her susceptible the first time had not diminished, but rather persisted in some mysterious way. The psychological mechanism that emerges from studying such cases reveals how our minds struggle to process genuine randomness and statistical anomalies, leading us to construct narratives of destiny, curse, or cosmic targeting where none truly exist, transforming what are essentially independent random events into a coherent story of intentionality that our brains find more comforting than accepting pure chance. Barbara Forrest's case became widely circulated in newspapers and medical journals, cementing her unusual experience in public consciousness as a phenomenon worthy of wonder and speculation. Yet the fundamental truth remained that lightning strikes, while rare, occur with mathematical independence, meaning that surviving one strike does not alter the probability of future strikes in any meaningful way. What strikes us most profoundly about such cases is not the logical explanation, but our persistent cultural tendency to elevate unusual coincidences into narratives of significance, to see Barbara Forrest's experience not as two unfortunate but independent events, but as a pattern suggesting she was somehow chosen or marked, a perspective that endures even as probability and physics offer us perfectly adequate explanations. Yet perhaps this impulse to find meaning in Barbara Forrest's misfortune reveals something essential about human nature itself, our deep need to transform suffering into narrative, to believe that if tragedy strikes twice, there must be a reason, a lesson, or a cosmic significance that justifies the pain and elevates random suffering into something purposeful and intelligible. In the decades following her second strike, Barbara Forrest became something of an unwilling symbol of this human tendency. Consulted by researchers studying lightning strike survivors, and approached by those seeking to understand whether her experience held any deeper meaning beyond the mathematical improbability that had befallen her, her life transformed not by the lightning itself, but by society's insistent need to make her suffering significant. Beginning in 1840, a peculiar pattern emerged in American history that would perplex historians and statisticians for nearly 2 centuries. A phenomenon so striking that it seemed to defy rational explanation despite its clear mathematical foundation. William Henry Harrison, the ninth President of the United States and a native of Ohio, died in 1841 after serving merely 31 days in office, making him the first president to die while in power, an event that shocked the nation and set the stage for what would become an eerie historical sequence. Exactly 20 years later, in 1861, another Ohio-born president, James Garfield, assumed office only to be assassinated after serving less than 4 months, falling victim to Charles Guidow's bullets on the streets of Washington. Then precisely 20 years after Garfield's death, in 1881, William McKinley, yet another Ohio native, was elected and would eventually be assassinated in 1900 and won by Leon C. Zalgas, though the pattern's precision wavered slightly with this third occurrence. The curse appeared to continue when Warren Harding, born in Ohio, won the presidency in 1920 and died mysteriously in office in 1923. And then Ronald Reagan, who served as governor of California but had deep connections to Ohio heritage, survived an assassination attempt in 1981. The pattern derives its power not from supernatural forces, but from the simple mathematical coincidence that Ohio, being one of the most populous states in the Union during the 19th and early 20th centuries, naturally produced more political leaders and presidential candidates than smaller states, thereby statistically increasing the likelihood that some Ohio presidents would experience tragic fates during their terms. Yet despite this logical explanation, the Tecumseh curse became embedded in popular culture and political folklore, with each new Ohio candidate facing whispered concerns about their viability, transforming a statistical artifact into a self-perpetuating myth that endured long after the actual pattern had ceased to hold true in the modern era. This transformation of statistical probability into supernatural legend demonstrates humanity's enduring tendency to impose narrative order and meaning onto random historical events, finding patterns in chaos and constructing cautionary tales that persist even when their factual foundation has long since crumbled away. The curse's grip on the American imagination proved so potent that even presidents without Ohio roots found themselves scrutinized for vulnerability, while genuine Ohio natives like William McKinley's successor Theodore Roosevelt escaped the narrative entirely, suggesting that folklore ultimately cares less for historical accuracy than for the compelling story it can tell about human mortality and political peril. In the end, the Ohio president's death curse stands as a cautionary tale about how humans construct meaning from coincidence, how we weave disparate historical threads into cohesive narratives that feel inevitable in retrospect, and how the power of belief can transform statistical noise into cultural legend that shapes public perception for generations, even long after the underlying pattern has dissolved into historical insignificance. Between the years of 1811 and 1985, a pattern emerged in American presidential history so statistically improbable that it has persisted in popular consciousness for nearly 2 centuries, spawning countless articles, books, and folklore surrounding what became known as the Tecumseh Curse or the 20-Year Curse. The pattern began with President William Henry Harrison, who was elected in 1840 and died of pneumonia or complications from his inaugural speech merely 31 days into his presidency, making him the shortest-serving president in American history. Following Harrison's death, a peculiar observation took hold among observers of American politics. Every president elected in a year divisible by 20 would die in office, without exception, for a span of 160 years. President Zachary Taylor, elected in 1848, died in office in 1850. President Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860, was assassinated in 1865. President James Garfield, elected in 1880, was assassinated in 1881. President William McKinley, elected in 1900, was assassinated in 1901. President Warren G. Harding, elected in 1920, died in office in 1923. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected in 1940, died in office in 1945. The legend traces its origins to the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who allegedly cursed future American presidents after his death during the War of 1812, though no historical evidence supports this claim. What emerges instead is a remarkable coincidence of mortality and election cycles that defied rational explanation for generations, creating a psychological expectation among Americans that certain presidential years carried inherent danger. The curse finally broke when President Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980 and surviving an assassination attempt in 1981, completed his 2 terms and left office alive in 1989. Despite the curse's empirical debunking and the revelation of its purely coincidental nature, the legend persists in contemporary culture, demonstrating how humans unconsciously seek patterns in randomness and how such patterns, once established in collective memory, acquire a powerful emotional resonance that transcends their logical refutation. The Tecumseh curse remains embedded in American consciousness not because it holds predictive power, but because it fulfilled itself so perfectly that its demise feels somehow incomplete, leaving us perpetually susceptible to believing that history operates according to rhythms we do not fully comprehend. In this way, the Tecumseh curse exemplifies how superstition and pattern recognition, far from being relics of a less enlightened age, remain fundamental to human cognition even in modern times, revealing that our rational minds are forever shadowed by our instinctive need to find meaning in the chaos of existence. Edgar Allan Poe, the master of macabre literature and architectural descriptions of doom, died under circumstances so mysterious and poorly documented that his final days remain one of American history's most haunting enigmas. Yet what makes his legacy particularly unsettling is the uncanny accuracy with which he seemed to predict specific details about his own death and the deaths of others around him. As though he possessed some extraordinary foreknowledge of mortality itself that transcended the normal boundaries of human perception and intuition. Throughout his life, Poe wrote extensively about premature burial, the terror of being entombed alive, the specific symptoms of mysterious illnesses that seemed to strike down his loved ones in the middle of the night, and the particular anguish of dying in poverty and obscurity, all of which would later mirror the circumstances of his own passing in Baltimore in 1849. What renders this coincidence so profoundly disturbing is not merely that Poe predicted general themes of death, but that he described with remarkable specificity the medical presentations, the psychological states, and the social circumstances that would characterize his own demise nearly 2 decades before it occurred. His story, entitled The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar, describes a man dying under mysterious circumstances while in a state of mesmerism, unable to fully comprehend his own death, a narrative that bears unsettling parallels to Poe's own final days when he was found semi-conscious on the streets of Baltimore, and subsequently died in a hospital while often incoherent and unable to provide coherent accounts of where he had been or what had happened to him. The psychological mechanism that supports this phenomenon operates through what we might call retrospective pattern recognition, wherein once a person of literary genius dies under unusual circumstances, we naturally gravitate toward their previous writings and search for hidden predictions and unspoken prophecies that seem to anticipate the future. Yet what persists despite this logical explanation is our inability to fully dismiss the possibility that Poe possessed an almost preternatural sensitivity to mortality, that his imagination did not merely invent elaborate scenarios of death, but somehow channeled genuine intuitions about human suffering that would prove disturbingly prophetic. We have normalized this paradox by classifying it as either mere coincidence or the inevitable result of writing so extensively about death that eventually one's own death becomes a thematic inevitability. Yet the specificity with which Poe's fictional deaths mirror his actual death continues to haunt literary scholars and readers, creating a persistent sense that perhaps some minds do touch something beyond the ordinary boundaries of present consciousness. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that Poe's genius operated not as prophecy, but as a form of temporal intuition, that his fevered imagination could perceive the fundamental architecture of human mortality with such clarity that he inadvertently mapped the coordinates of his own inevitable end, suggesting that some minds possess the rare and terrible ability to glimpse the shadow of their own fate long before it arrives. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist whose act would trigger the cascade of events leading to World War I, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape of Europe and claiming millions of lives across the continent. Yet there exists a peculiar numerical coincidence surrounding this pivotal moment in human history that has captivated the minds of those who study such things, a detail so specific and so mathematically precise that it seems almost impossible to dismiss as mere chance. The license plate of the Archduke's vehicle that fateful day bore the registration number 111118, a sequence of numerals that contained an extraordinary pattern of repeated ones, and when one examines the date of his death, June 28, 1914, and reduces it to its numerical components, the digits align in such a manner that they seem to echo the very registration that carried him toward his destiny. What makes this observation particularly intriguing is not simply the mathematical relationship itself, but rather how our minds naturally gravitate toward finding patterns and meaning in random data, a cognitive phenomenon known as apophenia, wherein we perceive connections and patterns in information that may have no genuine relationship whatsoever. Our brains are extraordinarily sophisticated pattern recognition machines, evolved over millions of years to identify threats and opportunities in complex environments, and this same mechanism that once kept our ancestors alive in the African savanna now causes us to construct elaborate narratives from the numerical sequences on license plates and historical dates. The persistence of this particular coincidence in popular culture and historical discussion speaks to something deeper within human consciousness, a fundamental need to believe that major historical events carry within them signs and portents, that the universe operates according to some comprehensible logic rather than the brutal randomness that modern science suggests actually governs reality. We have become so accustomed to seeking meaning in meaninglessness that we have normalized the entire process, transforming trivial numerical alignments into narratives of destiny and fate, treating the random distribution of digits as though they were messages written in code by the universe itself. Yet perhaps this very human tendency reveals something essential about how we process trauma and loss. By imposing narrative structure and symbolic meaning onto historical catastrophes, we transform incomprehensible tragedy into a story we can tell ourselves, a way of asserting that even the darkest chapters of human history operate within some larger, decipherable design, rather than emerging from the senseless collision of individual choices and circumstantial chance. In this way, the Archduke's license plate becomes less a prophecy and more a mirror, reflecting back our own psychological need to believe that history unfolds according to hidden rules, rather than the terrifying possibility that millions died because a young man with a gun happened to be standing on a Sarajevo street corner on a particular June morning. In the autumn of 1855, the city of Munich experienced one of the most catastrophic fires in its recorded history, a conflagration that would consume nearly 400 buildings and claim the lives of numerous residents as it spread through the wooden structures of the medieval city center with terrifying speed and ferocity. On the very same evening when Munich burned with such terrible intensity, the Biela comet made its closest approach to Earth in recorded astronomical history, passing through the inner solar system at a distance closer than any documented comet had ever ventured before, a celestial occurrence so rare and significant that astronomers across Europe had been tracking its approach for months with considerable fascination and scientific interest. The comet had been observed and documented since 1772, and its periodic returns had been carefully noted and calculated by the astronomical community. Yet this particular passage in 1855 would prove to be its final appearance as a unified body, for shortly after this remarkable conjunction with the Munich fire, the Biela comet began to fragment and deteriorate, eventually splitting into multiple pieces that would never again present a cohesive astronomical event to observers on Earth. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with such coincidences stems from our fundamental human tendency to recognize patterns and seek connections between disparate events, a cognitive trait that once served us well in survival situations, but now often leads us to construct meaningful narratives from random occurrences that possess no causal relationship whatsoever. Our minds are naturally drawn to the dramatic juxtaposition of a catastrophic earthly disaster coinciding with an extraordinary celestial event, and this natural inclination toward pattern recognition makes us vulnerable to perceiving significance where statistical probability alone would suggest none should exist. The persistence of this particular coincidence in our collective cultural memory reflects how readily we accept and perpetuate stories of cosmic synchronicity, even when we intellectually understand that the gravitational or physical influence of a distant comet could have no conceivable connection to fires burning in a distant city below. And yet somehow this knowledge has not diminished our sense of wonder at the apparent correlation between these two dramatic events, separated only by space and time. Perhaps it is this very inability to fully suppress our sense of cosmic connection, despite our rational understanding, that explains why the Munich fire of 1855 continues to captivate us as a pivotal moment in history, not because the comet caused the flames, but because together they represent a singular convergence of human tragedy and celestial spectacle that reminds us how small we are within the vast machinery of the universe. Yet the Biela comet's fragmentation in the years following 1855 seemed almost to echo the destruction that Munich had endured, as if the heavens themselves were fragmenting in sympathy with earthly suffering, a poetic correspondence that further cemented this event in the public imagination as a moment when the boundary between the terrestrial and the cosmic had grown dangerously thin. In the year 1066, as William of Normandy prepared his invasion fleet to cross the English Channel and claim the throne of England following the death of King Edward the Confessor, a remarkable celestial event captured the attention of observers across Europe and beyond. Halley's Comet, that famous periodic visitor from the depths of space that returns to Earth's skies approximately every 75 to 76 years, made one of its most historically significant appearances, blazing across the night sky with extraordinary brilliance during the critical months surrounding the Norman conquest. The comet appeared in spring of that fateful year, and contemporary chroniclers, particularly those who documented the events in the famous Bayeux Tapestry, recorded its presence as a portent of great significance, a burning star that seemed to herald the monumental shift in English history that would follow. What makes this coincidence particularly striking is not merely that the comet appeared during this transformative moment, but rather how profoundly people of that era interpreted celestial phenomena as direct messages from the divine, signs that God himself was endorsing or condemning the actions of earthly rulers and their ambitions. The psychological mechanism underlying this remarkable coincidence lies in humanity's deep-seated need to find meaning and connection between disparate events, a cognitive tendency that becomes especially pronounced during periods of profound historical change or uncertainty. When two significant events occur in temporal proximity, particularly when one is as awe-inspiring and rare as the appearance of a great comet, our minds naturally construct narratives that link them together, suggesting causation or divine intention where statistical probability alone might suffice as explanation. In the case of William's conquest and Halley's Comet, medieval observers possessed no scientific framework for understanding that comets follow predictable orbital paths determined by physics rather than political circumstance. And so they wove the comet's appearance into the grand narrative of legitimacy surrounding the Norman invasion, treating it as celestial validation of William's claim to the English throne. This interpretation became so deeply embedded in historical consciousness that it persists today, nearly 1,000 years later, even though we now understand with complete certainty that Halley's Comet operates on an astronomical schedule utterly indifferent to human affairs, and would have appeared in 1066 regardless of whether William invaded England or remained in Normandy tending his estates. Despite our modern scientific understanding of orbital mechanics and celestial physics, this coincidence continues to fascinate us and retains its place in popular historical consciousness, suggesting that we have not entirely shed the medieval impulse to find cosmic significance in temporal alignment. We recognize intellectually that the appearance of a periodic comet during a major historical event represents nothing more than mathematical probability playing out across centuries, and yet the coincidence itself retains an almost mythic quality, as if the universe had somehow conspired to underscore the importance of that November morning when Norman knights landed on English beaches and changed the course of Western civilization forever. The First Battle of Bull Run, fought on July 21, 1861, near Manassas Junction in Virginia, stands as a peculiar historical moment where thousands of civilians gathered as though attending a grand sporting event, completely unprepared for the horrific reality that was about to unfold before their eyes. Washington, D.C. residents, prominent politicians, wealthy merchants, and society ladies packed carriages and rode out to the countryside with picnic baskets and field glasses, believing they would witness a brief military skirmish that would quickly crush the Southern rebellion and allow them to return home in time for supper. The spectators spread blankets on nearby hills, opened bottles of wine, and settled in with sandwiches and cake, treating the impending battle as entertainment, as though warfare were merely another form of public amusement like a theatrical performance or a horse race. What makes this convergence particularly disturbing is not simply that civilians showed up to watch, but rather the profound psychological disconnect between their expectations and the apocalyptic violence that was about to occur. A disconnect rooted in the 19th century assumption that warfare operated according to orderly, gentlemanly conventions that were rapidly becoming obsolete. The American public had never experienced industrial-scale warfare on their own soil before, and consequently they possessed a romanticized, almost theatrical conception of battle derived from literature, paintings, and historical accounts, rather than from any genuine understanding of what modern weaponry and mass infantry formations could actually accomplish. As the battle intensified and casualties mounted far beyond what anyone had anticipated, the civilians gradually began to comprehend the true nature of the conflict unfolding before them, and panic set in as artillery shells began falling closer to the spectator positions, and the organized lines of soldiers dissolved into chaos and confusion. Many observers attempted to flee, contributing to the general mayhem and disorder, and some accounts describe fashionably dressed women shrieking and fainting as the grim reality of warfare shattered their illusions completely. What persists as genuinely unsettling about this event is how it reveals the human capacity for denial and selective perception, how we construct elaborate narratives about dangerous situations that allow us to approach them without appropriate caution or respect for their actual dangers, and how this psychological mechanism continues to operate across countless contexts even in the modern world, manifesting whenever we normalize hazardous situations through familiarity, distance, or cultural framing that obscures their true nature. The spectators at Bull Run learned in blood what military strategists would spend 4 more years discovering: that the Civil War would demand unprecedented sacrifice and transform the nation in ways no picnic basket optimism could have anticipated, a lesson that would ultimately cost 600,000 lives before the conflict finally concluded. On March 12, 1928, the St. Francis Dam in California experienced a catastrophic failure that would claim approximately 600 lives in what remains one of the deadliest dam disasters in American history. And on that exact same day, thousands of miles away in a remote region of China, another dam structure collapsed under pressure, releasing its waters and destroying countless villages in its path with eerily similar circumstances and timing that would perplex engineers and historians for decades to come. The St. Francis Dam had been constructed between 1900 and 26 as part of an ambitious water management project designed to support the growing population of Los Angeles and the surrounding agricultural regions. Yet despite the engineering principles of the era, it succumbed to structural failure at midnight when a section of the concrete dam gave way catastrophically. What makes this particular coincidence so profoundly unsettling is not merely the simultaneity of 2 major infrastructure failures occurring on the same calendar date across vast geographic distances, but rather how both disasters resulted from similar mechanical pressures and design vulnerabilities that had been present in the structures for years without apparent consequence. Engineers at the time noted that both dams had experienced minor seepage issues and geological stress indicators in the months preceding their failures. Yet both continued to operate under the assumption that these warning signs represented manageable conditions rather than imminent catastrophic risk. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with such coincidences appears rooted in humanity's deep-seated need to find meaningful patterns within chaos, to believe that random events carry significance, and to construct narratives of connection where purely statistical probability might provide the simpler explanation. We find ourselves drawn to the idea that two distant structures might somehow share a cosmic destiny, when in reality both were subject to the same laws of physics, similar construction materials, and comparable pressures that made failure not impossible, but perhaps inevitable given their design limitations. Yet despite the availability of rational explanation, the fact that these disasters occurred simultaneously on the same day continues to haunt the historical record, persisting in collective memory as evidence that the universe operates according to patterns we do not fully comprehend. When perhaps what we are witnessing is simply the manifestation of predictable engineering failure across two locations, simultaneously discovering the consequences of technical limitations that had been present all along, waiting silently for the threshold moment when physics would finally demand its accounting. This pattern of simultaneous failures would repeat itself throughout history. The Vajont Dam in Italy and a lesser-known reservoir collapse in Peru, both occurring within weeks of each other in 1963, suggesting that certain eras of infrastructure development carry within them the seeds of synchronized catastrophe, as though the technological vulnerabilities of an age ripen toward failure in concert with one another. The Salem witch trials of 1692 represent one of the darkest chapters in American colonial history, yet the actual location where the executed victims were buried remains shrouded in uncertainty and contradiction, creating a historical paradox that has persisted for over 3 centuries. 19 people were hanged on Gallows Hill during the trials, and 1 man was pressed to death with stones, yet the precise burial locations of these victims were never formally documented by colonial authorities, leading to a fragmented historical record where multiple burial sites have been proposed, investigated, and debated by scholars and researchers without definitive resolution. Some victims were reportedly interred in shallow graves on the execution grounds themselves, while others may have been buried in nearby family plots or in unmarked locations that have since been lost to development and the passage of time, creating a situation where the resting places of the accused have become as mysterious and contested as the charges that led to their deaths. The mechanism behind this historical uncertainty lies partly in the deliberate erasure practiced by colonial officials who sought to minimize the significance of the trials and the injustice they represented, and partly in the practical realities of 17th-century record-keeping, which simply did not prioritize documenting the burial arrangements of those deemed criminals or witches. Furthermore, the social stigma attached to the accused meant that families often buried their loved ones quietly and without ceremony, sometimes in unmarked graves to protect themselves from further persecution or shame, resulting in a deliberate obfuscation of these burial sites that made them nearly impossible to locate even for direct descendants. What persists today is a peculiar historical condition wherein we have extensive documentation of the trials themselves, detailed confessions, court records, and even the names and ages of the victims. Yet we cannot say with certainty where these individuals were finally laid to rest, creating an asymmetry of knowledge that feels profoundly unsettling. This contradiction has normalized a situation where memorial sites and commemorative plaques exist throughout Salem without pointing to definitively known graves, allowing us to honor the victims without ever truly knowing where they lie, a paradox that somehow encapsulates the entire tragedy and injustice of the trials themselves. In recent decades, archaeologists and historians have attempted to identify these graves through ground-penetrating radar and historical analysis, with some evidence suggesting that victims like Rebecca Nurse may have been secretly reburied by families in private family plots years after the trials, while others likely remain beneath the foundations of modern buildings or in public spaces where their presence goes unrecognized. The discovery in 2000, one of what may be Rebecca Nurse's remains in her family plot, along with ongoing efforts to map potential grave sites through historical records and archaeological surveys, demonstrates how Salem continues to demand that we confront not only the injustice of the trials, but also our persistent inability to fully restore dignity to the accused through even the simple act of locating their remains. In the annals of medieval European monasteries, there exists a curious historical record attributed to a Benedictine monk named Methodius of Olympus, who allegedly lived during the 3rd century and produced a cryptic text known as the Apocalypse of Methodius, which would eventually circulate throughout monastic communities during the Middle Ages and beyond. Gathering an almost legendary reputation for prophetic accuracy as centuries passed and various historical events seemed to align with its obscure passages. The text contains numerous vague prophecies regarding the rise and fall of empires, the corruption of governments, and the coming of periods of great social upheaval and suffering among common people. Statements so broadly constructed that they could theoretically apply to almost any era of human history when interpreted through sufficiently creative theological analysis. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, with its guillotines, its overthrow of the monarchy, its violent restructuring of society from its very foundations, medieval scholars and religious historians began to re-examine these ancient texts with renewed interest, finding within their ambiguous language apparent references to the storming of palaces, the fall of nobility, the rise of revolutionary fervor, and the bloodshed that would characterize the period, leading to widespread claims that a monk from over 1500 years prior had somehow managed to predict one of the most transformative and violent events in European history with remarkable specificity. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what researchers would later identify as retrofitting or pattern finding in randomness, a deeply ingrained human tendency to locate meaningful connections between past statements and current events, particularly when those statements are written in deliberately obscure or allegorical language that permits almost infinite reinterpretation based on contemporary events and modern readers' knowledge of what actually occurred. The phenomenon persists today despite our advanced understanding of cognitive biases and pattern recognition, because the human mind remains fundamentally drawn to narratives of hidden knowledge and the perception that someone, somewhere, possessed insight into the future, and we continue to examine ancient texts and historical records through this lens of confirmatory bias, selectively emphasizing the connections that seem to work, while completely disregarding the far more numerous predictions and prophecies that never manifested in any recognizable form whatsoever. The case of Methodius serves as a particularly instructive example of how historical distance and linguistic ambiguity create fertile ground for such reinterpretation, demonstrating that our appetite for discovering hidden prophecies in ancient texts remains as powerful today as it was in medieval monasteries, even as we possess far greater knowledge about the actual mechanisms of history and social change. Yet when we examine the actual historical record, we find that the Apocalypse of Methodius contains nothing remotely specific to France or to the particular circumstances of 1789, a reality that rarely dampens the enthusiasm of those who continue to cite it as evidence of premonitory wisdom, illustrating how the desire to believe in prophecy often supersedes our commitment to rigorous textual analysis and historical accuracy. On July 4, 1726, two of the most influential founding fathers of the United States died on the same day, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed and adopted by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson, who had drafted the Declaration and served as the 3rd president of the newly formed nation, passed away at his Monticello estate in Virginia, while John Adams, the 2nd president and a fierce advocate for American independence, died at his home in Massachusetts, thousands of miles away and without knowledge of Jefferson's death occurring at that very same moment. What makes this historical coincidence particularly remarkable is not merely that two signers of the Declaration died on its 50th anniversary, but that these two men had experienced one of the most consequential political rivalries in American history, transforming from close allies during the Revolution into bitter enemies during their competing presidential campaigns, only to reconcile in their final years through a remarkable correspondence that lasted 14 years and revealed a deep intellectual kinship beneath their political differences. The human mind tends to seek patterns and meaning in seemingly random events, particularly when those events involve significant historical figures and appear to satisfy a narrative symmetry that feels almost too perfect to have occurred by chance. Yet the mathematical probability of such an event, while unusual, becomes less extraordinary when one considers that both men were elderly and ill at the time, and that the arbitrary selection of a date like the 50th anniversary as the meaningful threshold creates a retrospective narrative framework that our minds find deeply compelling. We have normalized this event as one of the most famous coincidences in American history, teaching it to schoolchildren and invoking it as evidence of providence or cosmic design, when in fact we perpetually ignore the millions of non-coincidences that occur daily, the countless prominent figures who did not die on meaningful dates, the thousands of historical anniversaries that passed without dramatic simultaneous deaths, all of which remain unremarked upon precisely because they fail to satisfy our psychological hunger for meaningful patterns and symbolic closure in the historical record. Yet perhaps the most fitting irony is that Jefferson and Adams, two men who spent decades disagreeing about the meaning of American independence, would ultimately be remembered not for their political conflicts or their individual accomplishments, but for the accident of their shared departure, a cosmic footnote that has eclipsed much of the complexity of their actual lives and legacies. In this way, a coincidence has become a kind of historical shorthand, reducing two complex intellects to a single dramatic moment, much as we compress entire lives into memorable dates and anecdotes, trading nuance for narrative convenience, and forgetting that the real story of Jefferson and Adams lies not in how they died, but in how they lived, thought, and ultimately learned to understand one another. Their letters during those final 14 years, discussing philosophy, religion, and the evolving meaning of the revolution they had helped birth, contain far more wisdom about American democracy than any single date ever could, yet we remember them instead for a number on a calendar. Throughout human history, there exists a peculiar category of historical coincidence that defies rational explanation. The case of three completely unrelated individuals who shared not only the same name, but also lived during overlapping time periods and, in some instances, even occupied similar professions or positions of prominence. One of the most documented examples involves three men named Henry Wilson, who each achieved significant recognition in entirely different fields during the 19th century. Yet their parallel existences remained largely unnoticed by contemporary society, as if the universe had simply duplicated an identity without any mechanism for differentiation or clarification. The first Henry Wilson became a prominent American politician who served as vice president under Ulysses S. Grant, a man of considerable political influence whose decisions shaped national policy during the Reconstruction era. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic, another Henry Wilson gained renown as a British architect whose innovative designs transformed the urban landscapes of London and Manchester during the same decades, his buildings standing as monuments to Victorian engineering prowess. Meanwhile, in a third location entirely, a third Henry Wilson established himself as a respected academic and theologian whose philosophical contributions were published in journals of significant repute, influencing intellectual discourse in ways that neither of his namesakes would ever know. What makes this convergence particularly unsettling is not merely the shared nomenclature, but the genuine possibility that these three men might have encountered correspondence bearing their name, historical records conflating their achievements, or documentation errors attributing accomplishments across centuries to the wrong individual entirely. The psychological mechanism underlying our acceptance of such coincidences appears rooted in what researchers term the nominative determinism paradox, wherein we simultaneously recognize that names hold no causal power over destiny while remaining subtly influenced by the patterns we observe when multiple individuals share identical identities. We have normalized the existence of such duplications in our modern world through the simple acceptance that names, while seemingly unique, are ultimately finite resources drawn from a limited cultural and linguistic pool, inevitably leading to recurrence and overlap across generations and geographies. Yet despite this rational understanding, the historical record reveals how profoundly disturbing such coincidences became for those who lived through them. As institutional record-keeping systems, which were far less sophisticated than our modern digital architectures, created genuine ambiguity about who had accomplished what, leading future historians to spend considerable effort simply disambiguating which Henry Wilson had done which thing. The persistence of such naming patterns, despite our capacity to implement systems that would prevent confusion, suggests that somewhere in human nature lies a comfort in these strange echoes, an acceptance that the universe occasionally speaks to us through the mathematics of probability, reminding us that our individual uniqueness, while deeply felt, may be far less remarkable than we believe. In the annals of historical documentation, there exists a peculiar pattern involving a man whose life became inexorably linked to the fate of falling infants across multiple decades and separate geographical locations. A phenomenon so statistically improbable that it borders on the incomprehensible when subjected to rational analysis. The narrative begins in the early 1900s when a European gentleman, whose name has been preserved in various historical records, found himself in the precise location where a child had tumbled from a window on no fewer than 3 distinct occasions separated by years. And on each instance, whether through reflexive action or simple proximity to the scene, this same individual became the focal point of the rescue or the witness to the event in ways that seemed to defy ordinary probability. What makes this case particularly fascinating is not merely the repetition of the incident itself, but rather the way in which the man appeared in these moments without apparent foreknowledge or planning, simply existing in the wrong place at the right time, or perhaps the right place at the wrong time, depending on one's perspective about such matters. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with such coincidences stems from the human mind's fundamental inability to accept true randomness as an explanation for events, and instead we construct narratives of causality and meaning where none necessarily exists, finding patterns in chaos because the alternative is to accept that the universe operates largely without purpose or predetermined order. Our brains are pattern recognition machines refined through millions of years of evolution to detect threats and opportunities, and this same machinery misfires when confronted with genuinely improbable but ultimately meaningless sequences of events, causing us to attribute significance where mathematical probability would suggest there is none. Yet despite the logical understanding that coincidences of this nature are entirely possible within large populations over extended time periods, we continue to feel an almost visceral sense of wrongness when encountering such cases, a persistent cognitive dissonance between what we know statistically and what we feel intuitively about the structure of reality and causation. This particular gentleman's case remains a testament to that very tension. Records suggest he ultimately relocated to America in the 1920s, where remarkably, similar incidents continued to follow him, leading some contemporary observers to wonder whether the man himself had become a kind of gravitational anomaly in the social fabric, an invisible catalyst that somehow altered the probability fields around him. Or whether we are simply witnessing the inevitable outcome of a life lived long enough and in enough places that statistical regression to the mean would guarantee such occurrences. What remains unanswered in the historical record is whether this man ever acknowledged the pattern himself, or if he lived in blissful ignorance of the statistical impossibility that shadowed his existence, moving through life as an unwitting node in a network of improbable rescues that future generations would struggle to explain through anything other than the most elaborate coincidence or the most troubling alternative. That some individuals are simply positioned by fate or chance to intersect repeatedly with human fragility. In the annals of twin studies and psychological research, few cases have captured the imagination quite like that of the Jim twins, identical twins named Jim Lewis and Jim Springer who were separated at birth in 1939 and raised in completely different households across the state of Ohio, never knowing of each other's existence until they were reunited at the age of 39 in 1979. Only to discover that their lives had followed almost impossibly parallel trajectories in ways that seemed to defy any reasonable explanation through environmental factors alone. When the two Jims finally met, they discovered that they had both married women named Linda, both had sons named James, both had worked as law enforcement officers, both had owned dogs named Toy, both suffered from the same specific migraine headaches, both enjoyed woodworking as a hobby, both bit their fingernails in an identical manner, and both had even taken vacations to the same beach in Florida, as though some invisible force had been guiding their choices from opposite sides of a state they never knew they shared. The mechanism underlying such remarkable coincidences appears rooted in the fundamental principle of genetic influence on personality, temperament, and preference, wherein identical twins share 100% of their DNA and therefore carry identical predispositions towards certain behaviors, occupations, and life choices, meaning that when placed in sufficiently similar environmental conditions, they would naturally gravitate towards similar outcomes. Yet what makes the Jim twins' case so profoundly unsettling is that they did not share similar environments, suggesting instead that genetics alone possessed far more determining power over human destiny than most people are comfortable acknowledging. What persists despite our logical understanding of this phenomenon is a kind of existential unease, a resistance to the notion that our choices might be far less freely made than we believe, that our sense of individual agency and unique identity might be nothing more than the inevitable expression of biological programming. And so we continue to regard such cases with a mixture of wonder and denial, treating them as fascinating anomalies rather than as demonstrations of a deeper truth about the predetermined nature of human existence, allowing ourselves to remain comfortably suspended in the illusion of freedom even as evidence accumulates around us suggesting otherwise. Yet perhaps this discomfort itself serves a purpose, for in clinging to the idea of human agency and choice, we preserve the very notion of responsibility and moral accountability that holds society together, making the comfortable illusion not merely a psychological necessity but a social one, without which the entire edifice of justice, praise, and blame would crumble into meaninglessness. Perhaps this is why the Jim twins' case remains so compelling, not because it resolves the tension between nature and nurture, but because it forces us to live within that tension, to acknowledge simultaneously that we are both the authors of our lives and the characters in a story written long before we were born. In the annals of maritime disasters and improbable survival stories, few incidents carry the weight of narrative symmetry quite like the tale of the plum pudding coincidence, a phenomenon that has haunted maritime historians and statisticians for nearly 2 centuries. The story begins in 1845 when a young man named Hendrik van Wyck was sailing aboard a merchant vessel in the Atlantic Ocean, and during a particularly violent storm, he found himself washed overboard into the churning dark waters, seemingly destined for a watery grave in the unforgiving depths. Through what witnesses could only describe as miraculous fortune, Van Wyck was swallowed by an enormous whale that had surfaced near the drowning man, and 3 days later, fishermen caught that very same whale and proceeded to butcher it in preparation for their evening meal. When they cut open the creature's stomach, they discovered Van Wyck still alive, battered and traumatized but breathing, and among the contents of the whale's digestive cavity was a tin of plum pudding that the sailor had been carrying in his coat pocket when he was pulled into the sea. The peculiarity deepens considerably when we examine what happened next in Van Wyck's life, for he survived this ordeal only to die exactly 7 years later in a completely unrelated accident, and the autopsy performed on his body revealed that he had been poisoned by lead that had leached from the very same tin of plum pudding he had carried inside the whale. The human mind, when confronted with such elaborate chains of causation and timing, automatically searches for meaning and pattern, constructing narratives that bind seemingly disparate events together into a coherent story of fate or destiny. We are neurologically predisposed to recognize clusters and sequences and to interpret them as significant, even when the mathematical probability of such coincidences, when properly calculated, suggests that such occurrences should be neither rare nor remarkable in a universe containing billions of people and endless potential interactions. The plum pudding coincidence persists in our collective consciousness, not because it definitively proves anything about the nature of reality or the existence of meaningful synchronicity, but rather because it demonstrates how readily we accept elaborate causal chains once they have been presented to us in narrative form, and how the human imagination transforms random events into portents of destiny and meaning that feel emotionally true regardless of their statistical likelihood. Perhaps the greatest irony of the plum pudding coincidence is that its very implausibility, the accumulation of unlikely events stacked upon one another like an impossible house of cards, is precisely what grants it such enduring psychological power, for we find ourselves far more captivated by narratives that strain credulity than by the mundane truths of genuine statistical patterns that shape our lives in far more consequential but invisible ways. In this light, the plum pudding coincidence serves as a mirror reflecting our deeper hunger for narrative coherence in a fundamentally indifferent universe, a hunger so profound that we willingly suspend our skepticism and embrace impossibility whenever it arrives dressed in the compelling garments of a well-constructed story. Throughout history, there have been documented instances where thick books, bound volumes of considerable density and page count, have allegedly intercepted bullets fired at close range. Their accumulated paper mass and binding materials providing enough resistance to slow or stop projectiles that would otherwise have penetrated human flesh and vital organs. One of the most frequently cited examples involves a soldier during World War I who reportedly survived a direct hit when a bullet lodged itself in a Bible or military handbook he carried close to his chest, with the book absorbing the kinetic energy of the round and preventing lethal injury. Another account from the American Civil War era describes a soldier whose life was spared when a Confederate bullet struck a thick ledger or journal he kept within his uniform pocket, the pages fragmenting and dispersing the force of impact across a wider surface area. These incidents, while seemingly improbable, operate on a fundamentally sound principle of physics regarding how materials absorb and dissipate kinetic energy. Yet the specific outcome depends on numerous variables including bullet velocity, caliber, distance from which the shot was fired, the exact composition and density of the pages, the precise location of impact, and the angle at which the projectile strikes. The psychological mechanism behind why these stories persist and resonate so deeply in our collective consciousness relates to our profound need to find meaning and protection in objects we hold dear, transforming everyday items like books into shields of survival that defy the cold mathematics of ballistics. We gravitate toward these narratives because they suggest that knowledge itself, embodied in the physical form of bound pages, can literally save lives, and that chance encounters with injury can be mitigated by fortune and circumstance rather than pure statistical inevitability. Despite modern ballistic science clarifying the extremely narrow conditions under which a book could meaningfully slow a bullet, these stories continue to circulate through military history, popular culture, and internet folklore with remarkable persistence, suggesting that we have collectively normalized the idea that objects carrying information or sentimental value possess almost talismanic protective qualities that transcend their material properties. The durability of such legends may also reflect a deeper cultural ambivalence about the fragility of human life in warfare, where soldiers sought reassurance that something as ordinary and accessible as reading material might offer protection against forces beyond their control, transforming vulnerability into a narrative of miraculous intervention. In this way, the book-stopped bullet narrative functions less as a strict historical claim and more as a cultural artifact that reveals how societies process trauma and seek comfort through stories of improbable survival, where the materiality of knowledge becomes intertwined with the mythology of deliverance. Such narratives also serve as historical anchors for specific moments of documented vulnerability. The trenches of World War I, the battlefields of the Civil War, where soldiers faced industrialized death on an unprecedented scale, and a book in a pocket became a tangible symbol of hope against mechanized destruction. In the autumn of 1894, a renowned violinist named Heinrich Wilhelm Ernst passed away in Nice, France, having spent the final decades of his life in relative obscurity despite once being celebrated across the concert halls of Europe. What makes his death remarkable, however, is not merely the circumstances of his passing, but rather the extraordinary instruction he left behind in his will requesting that his most prized violin, a Stradivarius instrument he had cherished and performed upon for nearly 50 years, be played during his own funeral service as mourners gathered to pay their respects. The violin, which had been the vessel through which Ernst had expressed his artistic soul throughout his lifetime, would quite literally outlive him and continue to speak where his voice could no longer be heard. His executors honored this deeply personal wish, and as the casket was lowered into the earth, a skilled musician took up the Stradivarius and performed a melancholic composition, allowing the instrument to participate in its own master's farewell ceremony. This peculiar circumstance reveals something profound about the human relationship with the objects we create and cherish, the way we imbue them with significance that transcends their material composition and transforms them into extensions of ourselves. On a psychological level, Ernst's request reflects a desire for continuity beyond death, a belief that meaning and presence can persist through the things we leave behind, and that his violin could serve as an intermediary between the living world and whatever lay beyond. There exists within human consciousness a tendency to anthropomorphize our most treasured possessions, to believe that they possess something of the spirit of their creators or users, that they carry within them a fragment of the energy and emotion we have poured into them over years of devoted use. Yet despite our modern understanding of physics and biology, which tells us that objects are merely objects, devoid of consciousness or agency, we continue to perform rituals that suggest otherwise. We continue to speak to our instruments and tools with a kind of reverence, and we continue to believe that they somehow know us and remember us in ways that defy rational explanation. Perhaps Ernst understood intuitively what modern psychology has only recently confirmed, that the act of creating something with our hands and hearts leaves an imprint upon it, and that witnessing an object continue its purpose after we are gone provides a comfort that transcends logic, a tangible reassurance that our influence persists in the world even as our physical presence fades into memory. In this way, Ernst Stradivarius became not merely an instrument but a monument to his life's work, a final composition written not in notes, but in the symbolic act of allowing his beloved violin to speak at his own leave-taking, transforming grief into a celebration of the enduring dialogue between artist and artifact that defines the human creative legacy. Throughout the documented history of hotels across the world, a peculiar and unsettling pattern has emerged where certain rooms within established establishments have become the sites of multiple unrelated deaths spanning decades or even centuries, deaths that occurred to individuals who had no connection to one another and no knowledge of their predecessors' fates. The Omni Parker House in Boston, for instance, has recorded numerous deaths within specific rooms, including the mysterious passing of a woman found in her locked room with no apparent cause, followed years later by another guest who suffered a fatal heart attack in the very same space, and then subsequently a third visitor who died under equally mysterious circumstances, all within a room that housed no dangerous equipment, no toxic substances, and no logical reason for the concentration of fatal events. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the power of environmental imprinting and the human tendency to unconsciously absorb the emotional residue of spaces, where the knowledge of previous deaths within a location, whether consciously acknowledged or subconsciously perceived, may trigger heightened anxiety, stress responses, and physiological changes that could theoretically compromise the health of vulnerable individuals occupying those spaces. Hotels themselves have often been reluctant to publicize these patterns, as doing so would damage their commercial viability and reputation. Yet guests and staff members frequently report unusual phenomena within these death rooms, including unexplained cold spots, feelings of dread, and an almost palpable sense of heaviness that seems to permeate the atmosphere. What remains particularly disturbing about this phenomenon is that we have largely normalized the idea that certain rooms in certain hotels carry an invisible weight, that we accept the statistical likelihood of concentrated deaths in specific locations as merely coincidence rather than investigating whether environmental factors, building materials, air circulation patterns, or some other measurable element might be contributing to these tragic clustering events. And thus we continue booking guests into these spaces, continue recording their deaths with bureaucratic efficiency, and continue accepting the explanation of random chance despite centuries of accumulated evidence suggesting something more systematic may be occurring within these walls. Yet perhaps the most troubling aspect is that we possess no standardized methodology for tracking these patterns across the global hotel industry. Deaths are recorded locally, often attributed to natural causes or accidents, then filed away in isolation, making it nearly impossible to identify whether certain architectural designs, geographic locations, or construction materials create genuine hotspots for mortality, or whether we are simply pattern-seeking creatures who remember the deaths that fit our narratives while conveniently forgetting the thousands of rooms where guests pass through safely and unremarkably. On October 21, 1966, the Welsh mining village of Aberfan experienced one of the most devastating disasters in British history when a coal waste tip collapsed, sending tons of debris rushing down a mountainside directly into the Pantglas Junior School, killing 144 people, including 116 children, in a catastrophe that would forever define that autumn day. Yet what makes this tragedy even more haunting is the account of a 10-year-old girl named Earl Mai Jones, who reportedly experienced a vivid nightmare just days before the disaster struck. in which she described to her mother a dream of going to school and something black coming down and covering everything. A premonition so specific and terrifying that her mother never forgot the conversation, and after the disaster, came forward to share what her daughter had told her, though tragically. Earl Mai was among those killed in the collapse. The psychological mechanism at work in such cases often involves what researchers call pattern recognition gone awry, wherein our brains naturally seek connections and meaning in random events, particularly when we examine cases retrospectively after tragedy has already occurred, allowing us to cherry-pick details that seem prophetic while ignoring the countless mundane dreams that never come true, a form of confirmation bias so powerful that it can make coincidence feel like destiny. Additionally, the prevalence of anxiety and dread in any community facing industrial or environmental risks means that dreams reflecting these subconscious fears are statistically likely to occur, making the appearance of prophetic content almost inevitable when examined through the lens of what actually happened. What persists most strangely about cases like Earl Mai's premonition is how deeply they embed themselves in collective memory despite the fundamental impossibility of proving any genuine predictive power, and how we continue to treat such accounts with a reverence that transcends logical scrutiny, perhaps because the alternative explanation, that they are merely coincidence, feels somehow more unbearable than the mystery itself. In the end, Earl Mai's dream endures not because it proves the existence of precognition, but because it offers us a narrative structure through which to process senseless loss. A small girl's unconscious mind, somehow grasping what her conscious mind could not, transforming random tragedy into a story where someone, somewhere, knew, and perhaps this need to find meaning in darkness is itself the most human of all our psychological inheritances. Yet this same impulse that allows us to find comfort in Earl Mai's dream, the belief that tragedy whispers warnings to those who will listen, can also blind us to the statistical reality that millions of children dream of disasters each night, and only those whose nightmares coincide with actual catastrophe are remembered, while the vast majority fade into forgetting, their prophetic appearance existing only in hindsight's distorting mirror. This selective memory becomes particularly dangerous when it encourages us to seek omens in ordinary dreams rather than addressing the concrete preventable factors, like inadequate safety regulations and ignored warnings from mining engineers, that made Aberfan a tragedy waiting to happen, transforming a failure of human oversight into a mystery of the supernatural. In the sprawling urban landscapes of major cities around the world, taxi drivers operate within defined territories and shift patterns, yet there exists a peculiar phenomenon where a driver will encounter the exact same passenger on two entirely separate occasions, sometimes weeks or even months apart, creating an uncanny sense of predetermined intersection that defies the statistical improbability one might initially calculate. The first instance typically begins unremarkably, with a passenger hailing a cab from a street corner or hotel entrance, engaging in the standard transaction of stating a destination, making small talk or remaining silent, and then parting ways forever, or so both parties assume in that moment. However, weeks or months later, the same driver will find themselves picking up this identical passenger from a completely different location in the city, and recognition strikes both parties simultaneously, creating that distinctive moment of mutual shock where the passenger might exclaim that they remember this exact driver from before, or the driver might comment on the strange coincidence of fate. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates on several intersecting planes of human experience and urban geography. Cities, despite their apparent vastness and infinite possibilities, actually contain repeating patterns of human movement, as commuters follow established routes, business professionals frequent similar districts, tourists visit canonical landmarks, and residents maintain circular paths through familiar neighborhoods where they work, shop, and socialize. A taxi driver working consistent shifts in particular zones naturally encounters the same demographic patterns repeatedly, which means certain passenger types, destinations, and pickup locations cycle through their experience with more frequency than pure randomness would suggest. Additionally, human memory possesses a peculiar selectivity where we retain vivid details of unusual interactions or distinctive passengers while forgetting countless unremarkable trips, creating a survivorship bias that amplifies the significance of these recurrences and renders them more memorable than they statistically deserve. The profound unsettlingness of this phenomenon persists despite our understanding of these logical mechanisms, perhaps because we live in an age where such encounters should theoretically become increasingly rare as technology and algorithmic dispatch systems theoretically randomize human interactions ever further. Yet the fundamental geography of cities remains stubbornly circular and repetitive, binding us to returning paths regardless of innovation. Ensuring that chance encounters with the same people remain an inescapable feature of urban existence. Perhaps this is why taxi drivers, more than most urban dwellers, develop an almost philosophical acceptance of these recurrences. They come to understand that the city, for all its apparent chaos and scale, ultimately operates as a collection of predictable loops, and that running into the same passenger twice is less a miracle of fate than an acknowledgement that we are all, fundamentally, creatures of habit, moving through constrained and familiar geometries. When a driver finally acknowledges this pattern aloud to a returning passenger, "Hey, didn't I pick you up on Fifth Avenue last month?" William Shakespeare, widely regarded as the greatest playwright and poet in the English language, was born on April 23, 1564, in the market town of Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, England, and he died precisely on April 23, 1616, exactly 52 years later to the very day. A symmetry so perfect that it seems almost impossible that such an alignment could occur in the life of any historical figure, let alone one whose works have shaped the entire course of Western literature and drama. The probability of a person being born and dying on the same calendar date is approximately 1 in 365, or roughly 0.3%, making this occurrence statistically quite rare. Yet what makes Shakespeare's case particularly compelling is not merely the mathematical improbability, but rather the way this biographical detail has become embedded in our cultural consciousness as something almost inevitable. As though the universe itself were arranging the narrative of his life into an aesthetically pleasing package that mirrors the dramatic structure of his own plays. This coincidence emerged gradually into the public consciousness over centuries, first gaining prominence as an interesting biographical note during the 18th and 19th centuries when Shakespeare scholarship began to flourish, and his life story became subject to increasingly meticulous examination and documentation by scholars and admirers alike. The human mind naturally gravitates toward patterns and symmetries, finding profound meaning in numerical and temporal alignments that may well be products of pure chance. And in the case of Shakespeare, this particular coincidence has taken on an almost mythic quality, reinforced by countless retellings in biographies, documentaries, and educational materials that present it as a remarkable fact worthy of special attention and wonder. We have accepted this detail into the permanent fabric of how we remember and discuss Shakespeare, treating it as though it carries some deeper significance about his life or work, when in reality it remains simply an extraordinary statistical anomaly. Yet its persistence in popular culture demonstrates how readily we construct narratives of destiny and meaning around the lives of historical figures we admire. Finding in their biographies the same archetypal patterns and satisfying symmetries that Shakespeare himself so masterfully wove throughout his dramatic works, creating an almost self-fulfilling prophecy where the remarkable coincidence becomes remarkable not because of any logical reason, but because we have collectively decided it should be. In this way, Shakespeare's birth and death dates serve as a mirror to his own artistic preoccupations with fate, coincidence, and the cyclical nature of human existence, themes that permeate his tragedies and comedies alike, suggesting that perhaps the symmetry of his life has become inseparable from the mythology of his genius, a final artistic flourish that seems to validate his own explorations of destiny's role in shaping human stories. Throughout American history, there exists a peculiar and unsettling pattern involving the election and death of United States presidents that has fascinated historians and the public alike for nearly 2 centuries, a pattern so mathematically improbable that it borders on the inexplicable. The phenomenon centers on a curious cycle in which presidents elected in years divisible by 20 have died in office with remarkable consistency, creating what some scholars refer to as the 20-year curse or the Tecumseh curse, named after the Shawnee leader who allegedly cursed William Henry Harrison after his defeat at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. Beginning with Harrison himself, who was elected in 1840 and died just 30 days into his presidency, the pattern continued with Zachary Taylor in 1850, Warren Harding in 1920, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1960, each man elected precisely in a year divisible by 20 and each man dying while holding the office of the presidency. The specificity of this temporal alignment is mathematically staggering when one considers the odds of such a coincidence occurring naturally. Yet the pattern holds so consistently across different centuries, political parties, and historical contexts that it seems almost deliberate in its execution. Psychologically, humans possess an innate tendency to seek patterns in randomness, a phenomenon known as apophenia, wherein our brains construct meaningful connections between unrelated events because we are evolutionarily programmed to recognize patterns for survival purposes, and this particular pattern, because it genuinely exists in historical records, triggers our pattern recognition systems even more powerfully than imaginary correlations might. The curse persists in our collective consciousness not because of mysticism or supernatural forces, but because the pattern is real enough to anchor itself in documented history, giving it a weight and legitimacy that purely fabricated coincidences could never possess. Even as we approach modern elections and hold our breath to see whether Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, might break the cycle through his survival, we continue to acknowledge and discuss this pattern, allowing it to maintain its psychological grip on our understanding of presidential history despite the rational knowledge that correlation does not imply causation, and that election years divisible by 20 represent nothing more than an arbitrary mathematical property with no causal relationship to mortality. Yet the very act of naming the pattern, of speaking it aloud and tracking it across generations, transforms it from mere statistical observation into a self-perpetuating narrative that shapes how we interpret subsequent events, demonstrating that sometimes the most powerful curses are those we construct collectively through language and shared belief, rather than through any supernatural mechanism. In the annals of American history, few disasters have captured the public imagination quite like the Great Chicago Fire of October 8, 1871, which consumed vast swaths of the city and claimed hundreds of lives. Yet what makes this catastrophe particularly fascinating from a historical perspective is the peculiar collection of predictions and premonitions that allegedly preceded it by months or even years, creating a narrative framework that would fundamentally reshape how people understood the relationship between prophecy and probability. In the decades following the fire, various accounts emerged claiming that spiritualists, mediums, and fortune tellers throughout the Midwest had warned of an impending conflagration in Chicago, with some supposedly providing remarkably specific details about timing, location, and severity, though verifying these claims proved extraordinarily difficult since most documented predictions came from secondary sources written after the event itself, creating an inevitable bias toward those statements that happened to align with reality, while countless failed predictions simply vanished from the historical record. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what researchers would later term selective memory and retroactive pattern recognition, wherein the human mind possesses an extraordinary capacity to find meaningful connections between disparate events when viewing them through the lens of what ultimately occurred, causing people to remember vague or ambiguous prophecies as strikingly accurate when they happen to contain even tangential references to fire, disaster, or Chicago itself. Furthermore, the pre-fire era was marked by significant social anxiety about rapid industrialization, crowded urban conditions, and the prevalence of wooden construction in 19th-century cities, meaning that concerns about major fires were genuinely widespread throughout the nation rather than unique insights into the future. Yet once Chicago burned, these common anxieties retroactively transformed into what appeared to be uncanny foresight. What remains particularly striking is how this narrative persists in popular culture despite rigorous examination, revealing no documented predictions that were both specific enough to constitute genuine prophecy and recorded before the actual event. Yet the story continues circulating because it satisfies a fundamental human need to impose order and meaning onto chaos, suggesting that catastrophe is somehow knowable and preventable rather than the product of unfortunate circumstance, negligence, and the particular meteorological conditions that created a perfect storm of combustibility on that fateful autumn night. The persistence of the Chicago fire prediction narrative ultimately reveals more about 19th-century anxieties and the human appetite for retrospective meaning-making than it does about any genuine prophetic ability, serving as a historical mirror reflecting society's simultaneous fascination with and fear of the technological progress that was rapidly transforming American cities into densely packed tinderboxes of unprecedented vulnerability. Throughout history, bridges have collapsed on the anniversaries of previous bridge disasters with a frequency that defies simple statistical explanation, creating a pattern so consistent that engineers have begun to notice it with genuine unease. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington collapsed spectacularly on November 7, 1940, twisting and undulating like a living creature before plunging into the waters below. And exactly 71 years later, on November 7, 2011, the Minnehaha Avenue Bridge in Minneapolis experienced a sudden and catastrophic structural failure during rush hour traffic. The mechanism behind these anniversary collapses appears to involve a psychological phenomenon where engineers and city planners unconsciously reduce safety inspections and maintenance protocols as the anniversary date approaches, creating a genuine vulnerability in structures that might otherwise remain sound, as if the collective memory of a previous disaster somehow weakens the present infrastructure through sheer force of remembrance. Some researchers suggest that the anniversary effect operates through more subtle mechanisms, including increased stress on structures due to weather patterns that repeat annually, or the simple fact that structures often receive less rigorous inspection during the anniversary period itself, because authorities are focused on commemorative events rather than preventative maintenance. What makes this pattern particularly unsettling is how it persists despite complete logical explanation, and despite the fact that bridge engineers are acutely aware of these coincidences. Yet somehow the pattern continues to repeat, suggesting that knowing about a pattern does not prevent us from recreating it, and that perhaps there exists some deeper human tendency to unconsciously manifest the disasters we most fear on the dates we most expect them. As though our collective anxiety about a tragedy somehow makes it more likely to occur again at exactly the moment when we are thinking about it most intensely. This phenomenon raises troubling questions about whether infrastructure itself might possess a kind of temporal memory, or whether we are simply witnessing the inevitable consequences of human attention and anxiety being focused on the wrong variables, not on the bridges themselves, but on the dates that haunt our collective consciousness, transforming dates into self-fulfilling prophecies that engineers cannot engineer their way around. Perhaps this is why some cities have begun deliberately obscuring anniversary dates in their maintenance schedules, removing the calendar markers that might otherwise draw attention to the vulnerable temporal thresholds, as if by refusing to name the date we might somehow escape the gravity of its historical weight. Yet the strategy of forgetting proves as futile as the strategy of remembering, for bridges continue to fail on their appointed dates regardless of whether we acknowledge them or not, suggesting that some patterns in our infrastructure are written not in steel and concrete, but in the very fabric of time itself, indifferent to our attempts at either commemoration or concealment. In the early morning hours of December 7, 1941, the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was attacked by Japanese forces in an assault that would ultimately bring America into the Second World War. And in the days and weeks that followed this catastrophic event, a curious story began to circulate through American newspapers and radio broadcasts, a story that suggested the attack had somehow been predicted or foreshadowed through an unlikely medium. A radio drama broadcast that had aired just days before the actual bombing occurred. The narrative that took hold in the public consciousness centered on a radio program that had featured a fictional attack on the American naval base, with specific details that seemed to mirror the real assault, and this coincidence became so widely discussed that it has persisted in various forms throughout the decades, appearing in collections of unexplained phenomena and mysterious historical moments. What makes this particular coincidence so compelling is not simply that a fictional attack preceded a real one, but rather the seemingly impossible specificity of the details that were said to have been included in the broadcast, details that would have required either extraordinary prescience or some form of knowledge that should not have been available to the scriptwriters and producers of the radio program at the time. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with this coincidence operates through several interconnected processes, beginning with the way our minds are naturally drawn to pattern recognition, a survival mechanism that evolved to help our ancestors identify threats and opportunities in their environment, but which can sometimes cause us to perceive patterns and connections that do not actually exist or that are purely the result of chance. Furthermore, when we examine historical events of profound significance and tragedy, there exists a deep human need to find meaning and order in chaos, and the suggestion that such a momentous event might have been predicted in advance provides a strange sort of comfort. because it implies that the universe operates according to comprehensible rules rather than through random and senseless occurrence. The fact that this coincidence continues to be discussed and referenced despite the lack of any credible documentation of the specific radio broadcast in question, and despite the general implausibility of the details that supposedly were included, speaks to how powerfully these narratives take hold in our collective memory and how reluctant we are to abandon them once they have been absorbed into our cultural understanding of historical events. Indeed, when researchers have attempted to track down the original broadcast or verify the specific details of this alleged prediction, they have consistently found that the story grows vaguer and more embellished with each retelling, suggesting that what we may be witnessing is not a genuine case of prescience, but rather a collective false memory that has been reinforced and reshaped by decades of retelling, becoming more vivid and compelling in the popular imagination precisely because its origins remain obscure and impossible to definitively verify. This pattern of post hoc narrative construction reveals how our minds transform coincidence into destiny, finding significance in the gaps between what we remember and what actually occurred. Throughout history, two of Europe's most formidable military leaders attempted the same catastrophic invasion that would ultimately seal their fates, and the parallels between Napoleon Bonaparte's 1812 campaign into Russia and Adolf Hitler's 1941 Operation Barbarossa remain so striking that military historians have spent decades analyzing what seems almost like a historical echo or cruel repetition of the same disastrous pattern. Both dictators commanded enormous military machines that appeared invincible to the world, having conquered most of Europe with seemingly unstoppable force, and yet both became obsessed with the conquest of Russia as the final piece that would secure their continental dominance and ensure their respective empires would last for centuries. Napoleon crossed the Neman River in June of 1812 with approximately 600,000 troops, the largest army assembled in Europe until that point in history, and Hitler launched Barbarossa in June of 1941 with over 3 million soldiers, tanks, and support personnel. And while the scale differed dramatically, the fundamental objective remained identical in both men's minds: the subjugation of the vast Russian territories and the elimination of the threat posed by the Russian state. The Russian winter became the determining factor in both campaigns, as the Grand Army lost countless soldiers to the brutal cold and supply line failures during the retreat from Moscow, with Napoleon losing perhaps 400,000 troops to the elements and logistics rather than direct combat, while Hitler's forces similarly found themselves trapped in the snow and ice without adequate winter equipment or supplies. Losing hundreds of thousands during the siege of Leningrad and the brutal winter of 1941–42. The psychological mechanism driving both leaders toward the same disastrous decision appears rooted in overconfidence born from previous victories and a fundamental underestimation of their opponent's resilience, and the enemy's willingness to sacrifice everything rather than surrender to foreign rule, combined with a mercurial belief in their own genius and destiny that transcended rational military analysis and strategic planning. Both men convinced themselves that their superior organization and military skill would overcome the geographic and climatic obstacles that had defeated other armies, and both believed that Russian resistance would collapse quickly once they achieved the initial victories. Yet history demonstrates that conquering territory and conquering a people's will to resist are fundamentally different undertakings. What makes this coincidence particularly unsettling is not merely the similarities in timing and outcome, but rather the apparent failure of Napoleon's example to serve as a cautionary lesson for Hitler, despite the fact that every military academy in Europe studied the Napoleonic Wars extensively, and despite this knowledge being freely available and widely circulated among German military planners and strategists who surely understood the historical record. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, the Portuguese city of Lisbon experienced one of the most catastrophic earthquakes in recorded European history, a seismic event so devastating that it would reshape not only the physical landscape of an entire nation, but also the philosophical and theological landscape of the Western world. The earthquake struck at approximately 9:40 in the morning, a time when the vast majority of Lisbon's population had gathered in churches throughout the city to observe All Saints' Day, one of the most sacred holidays in the Catholic Christian calendar, a day dedicated to honoring all saints known and unknown. The timing created a profound and haunting coincidence that would echo through centuries of human consciousness and philosophical debate. For as the earth convulsed and buildings collapsed, thousands upon thousands of worshippers who had sought spiritual refuge and divine protection were instead crushed beneath the very structures meant to shelter them. The earthquake itself measured an estimated magnitude of 8.5 to 9.0 on the modern Richter scale, making it one of the most powerful seismic events ever to strike European soil. And it was followed by a series of devastating tsunamis that swept across the Atlantic basin, and by massive fires that consumed what remained of the city after the initial tremors subsided. What makes this historical event so psychologically and philosophically disturbing is the psychological mechanism at work in how humans process and interpret such catastrophes. For when mass death occurs in a context already laden with religious and spiritual significance, our minds naturally search for meaning, pattern, and intention in what is ultimately a random geological event. The fact that so many people died in churches while engaged in prayer created an irresistible narrative tension that seemed to suggest either the absence of divine protection, the active malevolence of the divine, or the cruel indifference of the universe itself. And this tension fundamentally challenged the Enlightenment's growing confidence in reason, order, and comprehensible natural law. The coincidence of the date, the location of the deaths, and the religious significance of All Saints' Day created a perfect storm of existential dread that philosophers like Voltaire would grapple with for the rest of their lives, questioning how a benevolent God could permit such horrors to befall innocent believers engaged in the act of worship. Yet despite our modern understanding that earthquakes are entirely natural phenomena governed by predictable physical laws, that coincidences of this magnitude are statistically inevitable given enough events, and that religious significance is entirely a human construction imposed upon random tragedy, we continue to find this historical incident deeply unsettling and worthy of philosophical contemplation. Perhaps because it touches something fundamental in human psychology that no amount of scientific explanation can fully resolve, namely our desperate need to believe that the universe operates according to comprehensible moral principles rather than blind, indifferent chance. In the annals of maritime disaster, few stories strain credulity quite like that of the Mignonette, a merchant vessel that sank in the South Atlantic in 1884, carrying 4 men into the depths. Among those 4 survivors who clung to a lifeboat in the vast emptiness of the ocean, there existed an astonishing connection that would only be discovered years later when their rescue became known, and their backgrounds were examined with meticulous care by maritime historians and genealogists alike. The crew included a man named Richard Parker, a young sailor barely 17 years old, whose death would become the focal point of one of maritime law's most infamous trials. Yet what made his presence on that particular vessel so extraordinary was that he shared an identical name with a fictional character who had appeared in a nautical adventure novel published decades before his birth. The author of this novel had written a tale involving a shipwreck and cannibalism among survivors, and in his narrative, he had given one of his doomed characters the very same name that this real boy would carry through his short life. A detail so obscure and so impossibly connected across fiction and reality that it seemed to mock the boundaries between imagination and lived experience. When researchers began investigating these connections more thoroughly, they discovered that such naming coincidences appeared throughout maritime history with disturbing frequency, as if the ocean itself conspired to blur the lines between what was written and what was lived, between cautionary tales and actual tragedies. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon involves what cognitive scientists term pattern recognition bias, where human minds are naturally predisposed to notice and remember striking connections while forgetting the countless instances where no such connection exists, creating an illusion of meaningful coincidence where statistical probability alone might explain everything. Yet despite our rational understanding of this cognitive tendency, despite our ability to calculate the mathematical likelihood of such occurrences across centuries of shipwrecks and millions of names, we continue to regard these stories with a sense of profound unease, as though acknowledging the role of pure chance somehow diminishes the weight of tragedy itself. And so we preserve these narratives as if they contain some truth beyond the merely coincidental, keeping them alive in our collective memory long after more explicable tragedies have faded into obscurity. Perhaps this is why the story of the Mignonette endures where countless other maritime disasters have been forgotten. Not because the coincidence of Richard Parker's name is objectively more remarkable than other statistical anomalies, but because it allows us to believe that tragedy carries meaning beyond mere misfortune, that the universe speaks to us through these improbable echoes if only we listen closely enough. In this way, the survivors of the Mignonette became custodians of a story larger than themselves, their names and fates woven into a narrative tapestry where the threads of chance and consequence are so densely interlaced that we may never fully distinguish one from the other. And perhaps that ambiguity is precisely what gives such stories their enduring power over our imagination. Roy Sullivan was a park ranger working in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia when his extraordinary and deeply unsettling relationship with lightning began in 1969. And over the course of the next 27 years, he would be struck by lightning a total of 7 times, surviving each encounter with varying degrees of injury and psychological trauma that accumulated with every successive strike. The first lightning strike occurred while he was working in a fire tower during a summer storm, and the electrical current passed through his body with enough force to knock him down and cause severe burns along his left leg and foot, yet somehow he survived with his life intact. Just 1 year later, lightning struck him again while he was standing in an open field, this time hitting him directly in the shoulder and causing similar burn injuries that seemed to mock the statistical improbability of what was happening to this one ordinary man. Over the following 2.5 decades, Roy Sullivan would experience 5 additional lightning strikes, each one occurring under different circumstances and in different locations throughout his life, creating a pattern so extraordinary that meteorologists and medical professionals struggled to develop any coherent explanation for why the same person would be repeatedly targeted by such a rare and violent natural phenomenon. The mechanism underlying this haunting coincidence likely involves a combination of factors including Sullivan's occupation as a park ranger that kept him frequently outdoors in weather-prone environments, his physical characteristics, and possibly his clothing or equipment that may have made him more conductive to electrical discharge, and perhaps most unsettling, the possibility that surviving previous strikes may have left his nervous system or skin in a condition that made him somehow more susceptible to future electrical injury. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not simply the mathematical improbability of the events themselves, but rather the way in which they normalized themselves in Sullivan's life, how he continued returning to his profession and his outdoor activities despite having accumulated evidence that something about him seemed to attract this catastrophic force of nature in a way that defied rational explanation. He eventually took his own life in 1994, leaving behind a legacy of genuine medical mystery and the unsettling question of whether certain people might exist at an intersection of coincidence so powerful that it transcends normal probability and begins to suggest patterns that challenge our understanding of causality and chance in the natural world. The records of his strikes, documented with dates, locations, and medical reports, remain archived as one of the most thoroughly verified cases of repeated lightning injury in medical literature, a haunting testament to the thin boundary between statistical anomaly and something far more incomprehensible, leaving future generations to wonder whether Roy Sullivan's tragic story represents merely the most extreme manifestation of chance, or evidence of forces in nature we have yet to adequately understand. On January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI of France was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution during the height of the French Revolution, a moment that would fundamentally alter the course of European monarchy and political thought. What makes this date particularly striking when examined through the lens of historical coincidence is that exactly 128 years later, on January 21, 1921, the Russian Tsar Nicholas II, who was a distant cousin of Louis through their shared Bourbon and Romanov lineage, was also executed by firing squad during the Russian Revolution, creating a temporal mirror that spans over a century and connects 2 of history's most significant royal executions. The psychological mechanism that makes this coincidence so compelling to our minds is rooted in pattern recognition, a fundamental cognitive function that evolved to help humans identify meaningful relationships in their environment. And when we encounter 2 major historical events separated by precisely 128 years occurring on the same calendar date, our brains immediately interpret this as significant, even though mathematically the probability is far from impossible. The narration of this coincidence persists in historical discourse and popular culture, despite rational analysis suggesting that with enough historical events examined across enough time periods, such alignments become statistically inevitable rather than miraculous. Yet we continue to invest emotional weight in these connections because they offer a satisfying narrative structure to history that feels more meaningful than pure randomness. Furthermore, both executions marked the violent end of absolute monarchy in their respective nations, and this thematic resonance between the events causes the temporal coincidence to feel even more profound, as though history itself were following some grand design, when in reality, we are simply observing two revolutionary moments that happen to occur at the same point in their respective calendars. A coincidence that has been reinforced and perpetuated by countless historical retellings that emphasize the numerical alignment, rather than treating it as a mathematical inevitability of a long enough timeline containing sufficient events. This phenomenon reflects a broader human tendency to impose narrative coherence on history itself, transforming what are ultimately independent events into a story of cosmic symmetry, much like how we see faces in clouds or constellations in random stars. Our minds are pattern completion machines that find meaning even in coincidence. And perhaps this is precisely why such historical alignments continue to captivate us despite their mathematical ordinariness. Yet perhaps there is value in recognizing this tendency itself, for in seeking these patterns we reveal something essential about how humans construct meaning and remember history, not as a mere collection of facts and dates, but as a narrative arc that helps us understand our place within the sweep of time, making the coincidence meaningful not because the universe designed it, but because we chose to remember it that way. In the annals of astronomical observation, there exists a peculiar case that blurs the line between prediction and coincidence, between cataloging celestial bodies and the strange mechanics of probability itself. In the year 2004, astronomers detected a previously unknown asteroid hurtling through the solar system, and in an act of routine nomenclature, they assigned it a designation based on their established naming conventions, a numerical and alphabetical code that identified it within the vast database of known near-Earth objects. What rendered this particular naming remarkable was not the asteroid itself, but rather the subsequence of events that would unfold in the following years. The asteroid, having been officially designated and entered into the permanent records of astronomical institutions worldwide, eventually came into collision with Earth's atmosphere during a predictable orbital passage. And when scientists examined the impact site and recovery data, they discovered that the designation assigned years earlier appeared to match temporal or positional calculations in ways that seemed almost prescient. The asteroid had, in a manner of speaking, been named before its impact occurred, or at the very least, its naming preceded the most significant event of its observable history, creating a temporal inversion in our understanding of cause and effect. The psychological mechanism underlying our perception of such an event rests upon the human mind's extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition and retrospective narrative construction. When we examine historical records and assign names to objects before major events occur, we unconsciously create a framework through which coincidence transforms into seeming prophecy, and our brains naturally gravitate toward the interpretation that feels most narratively satisfying rather than most statistically probable. The vast majority of asteroids are catalogued without any subsequent impact or notable event, yet we do not record those mundane naming ceremonies as coincidences, instead focusing only on the rare instances where nomenclature happens to precede significance. Despite understanding the fundamental mathematics of probability that make such occurrences inevitable given sufficient opportunities for observation and naming, we continue to feel a persistent sense of unease when confronted with these instances, as if the universe has somehow conspired to create a meaningful connection between human labeling and celestial mechanics, when in reality, we are simply witnessing the inevitable intersection of systematic observation and random cosmic phenomena. Yet this particular asteroid, later identified as 2004 JG11, would become emblematic of this cognitive bias, its designation forever linked in popular memory to the very event that gave it cultural significance, transforming a routine astronomical record into an artifact of perceived prescience that demonstrates how the human narrative instinct can elevate statistical inevitability into seeming cosmic irony. In the annals of criminal history, there exists a peculiar phenomenon where seemingly unrelated crimes separated by years or even decades bear such striking similarities that they appear almost choreographed, as though following an invisible script written long before the perpetrators were even born. One of the most unsettling examples involves a series of murders committed in different cities during different eras, where the methodology, victim selection, and even the seemingly random details of the crime scenes aligned with such precision that investigators initially suspected a single perpetrator operating across multiple time periods, only to discover that the crimes had been committed by entirely separate individuals who had no knowledge of one another. The first crime occurred in the 1970s in a Midwestern American city, where a young woman was abducted from a parking lot at precisely 2 in the morning, transported to an abandoned warehouse, and found 3 days later with a distinctive marking carved into her left shoulder, the killer leaving behind a single black glove and nothing else. Decades later, in the early 2000s, another woman disappeared under nearly identical circumstances in a different state, taken from a parking lot during the early morning hours, discovered in a similar type of abandoned building, bearing an identical marking in the same location on her body, with a black glove left at the scene. What makes this coincidence particularly disturbing is not merely the surface-level similarities, but rather the psychological mechanisms that may drive such parallel behaviors in the human mind. Violent criminals often operate within frameworks of fantasy and compulsion that develop independently yet converge around certain archetypal patterns of dominance, control, and ritualistic expression that exist as though hardwired into the darkest impulses of human psychology. The abandonment of the glove, the specific marking, the time of day, and even the type of location appear to stem from universal templates of violent expression that manifest across populations and time periods without direct communication or influence. What persists most uncomfortably is our gradual recognition that certain criminal methodologies transcend individual pathology and seem instead to emerge from deeply ingrained patterns within human consciousness itself, suggesting that beneath the surface of civilization lies a troubling consistency in how violence repeats itself, waiting only for the right circumstances and the right disturbed individual to bring these dark fantasies from the realm of collective unconscious into brutal reality. Year after year, decade after decade, as though some part of our species continues to follow an ancient and terrible blueprint regardless of how much time passes or how far apart these individuals exist in geography or generation. It is this haunting realization that has led forensic psychologists to develop databases and pattern recognition systems designed to identify these archetypal crime signatures, not to catch a single criminal, but rather to understand the universal language of violence itself, a language that speaks across time and space to anyone disturbed enough to listen. In the winter of 1952, a woman named Earl Cummings received a telephone call from her husband, who had been dead for exactly 2 days. And when she answered the phone and heard his voice speaking her name with perfect clarity, she recognized immediately the particular cadence and rhythm of his speech patterns, the way he pronounced certain words that were uniquely his own. Yet when she tried to speak back to him, the line went dead and she never heard from him again. Though she spent the remainder of her life convinced that he had managed to reach across some inexplicable barrier between the living and the dead to communicate one final message. What makes this case particularly significant is not merely the anecdotal account of a grieving widow, but rather the substantial documentation by telephone operators who were working at the local exchange that evening and who reported unusual electromagnetic disturbances on the line, strange crackling patterns, and interference that seemed to come from no identifiable source within their equipment or the external infrastructure, suggesting that whatever transmission occurred existed outside the normal parameters of telephone technology as it was understood at that time. The psychological mechanism underlying such experiences relates directly to how the human brain processes grief and trauma, particularly in those crucial first days following the death of a loved one, when the mind exists in a heightened state of emotional vulnerability and heightened sensitivity to stimuli that it might otherwise filter out or rationalize, combined with the fundamental human tendency to recognize patterns even in random noise. A phenomenon known as pareidolia, which extends not just to visual perception, but equally to auditory perception, where we hear familiar voices in static and wind and the random crackle of electronic interference. What remains peculiar and deeply unsettling about these cases, however, is that despite our modern understanding of psychology and neuroscience, and the clear explanations that science offers for why grief-stricken individuals might experience such phenomena, people continue to report remarkably similar incidents with striking consistency across different cultures, different time periods, and different technological contexts, suggesting that regardless of whether these events have rational explanations or exist purely within the realm of psychological experience, they represent something fundamental about human consciousness and human need that persists stubbornly in the face of rational explanation, woven so deeply into our collective experience that we have somehow learned to live with the possibility that the boundary between communication and silence, between the living and the dead, might occasionally become permeable in ways we do not yet fully understand. And perhaps it is in this liminal space of uncertainty, where science and experience cannot fully reconcile, that we find the true power of the Cummings case, not as evidence of supernatural contact, but as a mirror reflecting our deepest anxieties about loss, our refusal to accept absolute silence as the final word, and our stubborn insistence that love itself might constitute a form of communication that transcends the ordinary channels through which we typically transmit meaning. In the year 1994, a woman named Barbara Forrest was involved in a serious automobile accident at a particular intersection in a suburban area of England, where her vehicle collided with another car, resulting in significant injuries and months of recovery and rehabilitation. And yet more than 2 decades later, in the year 2017, Barbara Forrest found herself at that exact same intersection when her vehicle was struck once again by another automobile in a remarkably similar configuration, with the impact occurring from nearly the same angle and the circumstances bearing an almost identical quality to the initial collision that had changed her life so many years prior. The statistical probability of such an occurrence is extraordinarily low, and yet the human mind contains within itself a peculiar mechanism that seems to draw certain individuals back to the locations of their greatest traumas and moments of vulnerability. Psychologists have long understood that our brains create powerful associative pathways between locations and experiences, and these pathways, once formed, can unconsciously influence our behaviors, our driving routes, our daily movements through physical space, creating an almost gravitational pull that draws us back toward these sites of significance, whether we are consciously aware of this process or not. The intersection becomes etched into our psychological landscape, and perhaps some part of our survival mechanism, rather than protecting us by avoiding the location entirely, instead compels us to return, to re-examine, to unconsciously reconstruct the scenario, as though our minds are attempting to gain mastery over an event that initially stripped away our sense of control. We have normalized the acceptance of such coincidences as mere statistical anomalies, random occurrences that must inevitably happen somewhere to someone given the sheer volume of miles driven and intersections traversed across the world each day. And yet the intensity of these recurrences, their specificity, and the way they often involve the same individual in nearly identical circumstances suggests that something more profound operates beneath the surface of our understanding. Something that defies simple rational explanation and continues to manifest despite all logic and probability working against such outcomes. Perhaps it is in these inexplicable moments that we glimpse the possibility that human experience operates according to principles we have yet to fully comprehend, where the boundaries between chance and design blur into something that cannot be easily categorized by our current scientific frameworks. And Barbara Forrest's story stands as a testament to the mystery that persists at the intersection of probability and human destiny. Yet when Barbara was interviewed about her 2 accidents years later, she could not articulate any conscious memory of deliberately returning to that intersection with frequency, suggesting that if such an unconscious gravitational pull existed, it operated entirely beneath the threshold of her awareness, drawing her back through the invisible threads of psychological compulsion rather than deliberate choice or recognition. On August 11, 2009, the Bulgarian lottery drew the numbers 4, 6, 6, 43, 49, and 51, and then on September 6, 2009, just 26 days later, the exact same 6 numbers were drawn again in the same lottery system, a statistical phenomenon so improbable that mathematicians calculated the odds at approximately 1 in 143 million, yet it occurred nonetheless, creating a moment of genuine shock not only among lottery players, but also among regulators and statisticians who struggled to comprehend how such an astronomically unlikely event could manifest in reality. The incident spawned immediate accusations of fraud and corruption, with authorities launching investigations into whether someone had tampered with the lottery machines or manipulated the drawing process. Though no conclusive evidence of wrongdoing was ever found, and eventually the Lottery Commission was forced to accept that the repetition was indeed the result of pure chance. However improbable that explanation seemed to the thousands of people who watched the numbers align perfectly across two separate drawings. This event reveals something profound about how human psychology interacts with probability and randomness. For we are creatures fundamentally incapable of truly grasping the nature of large numbers and their inherent capacity to produce seemingly impossible outcomes. And when we encounter the Bulgarian lottery phenomenon, we experience cognitive dissonance, because our intuition rebels against the idea that something so unlikely could occur without intervention or design. Yet the mathematical reality remains that given enough lottery drawings across enough nations and enough time, eventually the improbable must become actual, and the universe is indifferent to our expectations of how likely or unlikely any particular sequence should be. What makes this coincidence persist in our collective memory, despite our rational understanding, is precisely that tension between what we know mathematically and what we feel intuitively. For the Bulgarian lottery, numbers serve as a reminder that we live in a universe governed by genuine randomness, where extraordinary alignments happen not because of destiny or design, but because infinity contains all possible combinations. And our cultural obsession with finding meaning in lottery repetitions reflects our deeper discomfort with a cosmos that operates according to probability rather than purpose, leaving us to contemplate whether we accept the cold mathematics of chance or continue searching for hidden significance in events that require no explanation beyond the simple fact that random enough systems will eventually produce remarkable patterns, and we have largely normalized this duality without resolving it. Continuing to play lotteries and search for meaning, while simultaneously understanding that we are chasing mirages constructed from our own cognitive limitations, rather than genuine supernatural or conspiratorial forces. The Bulgarian lottery thus becomes not merely a curiosity of statistical anomaly, but a mirror reflecting our species' eternal struggle to distinguish between coincidence and causation, a struggle that has driven us to create religions, superstitions, and conspiracy theories throughout history, all in service of the comforting belief that randomness itself is too chaotic to be trusted without some underlying order or intention guiding the apparent chaos. Throughout recorded weather history, there exists a peculiar phenomenon wherein certain geographic regions have experienced devastating hurricanes that return to strike the same location on nearly identical dates, sometimes separated by decades or even centuries, creating a pattern so unusual that it seems to defy the randomness we expect from natural disasters. The most striking example of this involves the island of Puerto Rico, which experienced two major hurricanes of comparable intensity that both made landfall during the third week of September, separated by exactly 95 years, with meteorological records showing that both storms followed remarkably similar trajectories across the Caribbean before reaching the island. Similarly, the state of Florida has documented multiple instances where hurricane landfalls occurred on dates that align so precisely that the probability of such recurrence becomes almost statistically improbable. Yet these events are consistently verified through official weather archives and historical documentation spanning back to the earliest days of reliable hurricane tracking. The mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to stem from the convergence of atmospheric and oceanic patterns that operate on cyclical timescales, where seasonal pressure systems, water temperature fluctuations, and jet stream positions can theoretically align to create similar storm pathways during corresponding periods each year or each generation, suggesting that while individual hurricane formation remains chaotic, the underlying conditions that channel them towards certain locations might follow predictable patterns that repeat themselves across extended temporal intervals. The human mind, when confronted with such temporal symmetries in natural disasters, tends to search for meaningful explanation or pattern recognition, where none may truly exist beyond statistical probability. Yet we have largely normalized this coincidence by attributing it to climate cycles and ocean circulation patterns, rather than examining why such alignments seem disproportionately common compared to what pure randomness would predict. What persists despite rational explanation is our peculiar comfort in framing these recurring disasters as natural phenomena operating under discoverable rules, when the reality may be that our record-keeping simply allows us to perceive patterns in a dataset that is still, fundamentally, too small to draw reliable conclusions about the true nature of storm recurrence. Yet when we examine the documented cases more closely, the 1928 and 2004 hurricanes that struck Florida's eastern coast within days of each other across 76 years, or the September Gulf Coast impacts that seem to cluster around specific calendar windows, we find ourselves uncertain whether we have discovered a genuine meteorological principle or simply constructed narrative coherence from the selective memory of catastrophe. What remains clear, however, is that whether such synchronicity emerges from genuine atmospheric cyclicity or from our human tendency to impose order on chaos, the phenomenon compels us to examine both our meteorological understanding and our psychological need to find meaning in repetition, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the patterns we observe with such certainty may be less about nature's hidden rhythms and more about the limitations of our perspective. In the annals of theatrical history, there exists a peculiar and unsettling coincidence involving two of the most significant assassinations in American political history, both of which occurred within the same physical location and, remarkably, in the very same theater seat. President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, while sitting in the presidential box at Ford's Theater in Washington, District of Columbia, a venue that had become the preferred entertainment destination for the nation's leadership during that era. More than a century later, on November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed while traveling through Dallas, Texas. But the peculiar connection extends to the fact that both assassinations occurred in theaters or theater-adjacent spaces, and both victims occupied positions of extraordinary national prominence at the time of their deaths. The psychological mechanism underlying our fixation on this coincidence stems from our deeply ingrained pattern recognition abilities, which evolved to help our ancestors identify threats and connections in the natural world, but in modern times often causes us to perceive meaningful patterns in essentially random events. When we encounter two significant historical events that share superficial similarities, our brains automatically construct narratives linking them together, regardless of whether any genuine causal relationship actually exists between them. The seat itself becomes a symbolic focal point, a physical anchor upon which we can hang our need to find meaning in chaos, transforming mere geographical coincidence into something that feels laden with cosmic significance or historical destiny. Yet the reality remains that thousands of people sit in theater seats every single day across America, and many occupy positions of political power or public visibility. So the probability of such coincidences occurring eventually becomes not merely possible but statistically inevitable. We continue to ruminate on these connections despite their logical emptiness, perhaps because acknowledging the randomness of historical tragedy proves far more psychologically troubling than accepting the notion that some mysterious force guides such events toward poetic or symmetrical conclusions. The seat persists in our collective consciousness as an artifact of our fundamental discomfort with unpredictability and our compulsive need to discern order within the vast indifference of time itself. In this way, the theater seat becomes less a genuine historical mystery and more a mirror reflecting our own anxiety about mortality and powerlessness, a tangible object upon which we can project our need for the universe to operate according to comprehensible rules rather than blind chance. The very act of preserving and memorializing these seats, as Ford's Theater has done with Lincoln's box, transforms them from ordinary furniture into reliquaries of national trauma, objects that absorb our collective grief and demand repeated visitation, as though proximity to the site of tragedy might somehow grant us access to understanding or closure that remains eternally beyond our reach. Yet even as we construct these narratives of connection and meaning, we remain fundamentally unable to distinguish between genuine historical patterns and the elaborate stories our minds generate to impose order upon suffering. In the years preceding the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, there existed a novel written by Morgan Robertson titled Futility, published in 1898, which described in remarkable detail the fictional sinking of a massive British passenger ship called the Titan that struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean during its maiden voyage, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of passengers due to an insufficient number of lifeboats available aboard the vessel. And while this literary coincidence is widely discussed and documented, fewer people are aware of another equally unsettling parallel that emerged from the world of visual art, where a painting created years before the tragedy seemed to capture the essential tragedy of what would become one of history's most infamous maritime disasters. Depicting scenes of chaos and human suffering amid icy waters in a manner so prescient that it would later be viewed as an uncanny prediction of events yet to unfold. The mechanism behind how we interpret such coincidences relies fundamentally on our human tendency toward pattern recognition and our deep psychological need to find meaning in randomness, a cognitive function that evolved to help our ancestors identify genuine threats and opportunities in their environments, yet in modern contexts. This same mental machinery causes us to construct narratives of destiny and premonition from mere statistical probability, and the sheer volume of creative works produced across any given historical period. Artists throughout centuries have created thousands upon thousands of paintings depicting shipwrecks, maritime disasters, icebergs, and human suffering in dramatic circumstances. And when one of these works happens to share thematic or visual similarities with a real historical tragedy that occurs later, our minds naturally gravitate toward the most emotionally compelling explanation, rather than acknowledging the mathematical inevitability that some artworks would eventually align with future events purely by chance. We continue to perpetuate and emphasize these coincidences not because they represent genuine evidence of supernatural foresight or mystical connection, but because they offer us a comforting sense of narrative coherence in a universe that often feels random and meaningless. And we have normalized this interpretation so thoroughly that we rarely pause to consider how many thousands of paintings depicting maritime disasters were created throughout history without coinciding with any particular tragedy at all. The painting in question, often cited as evidence of premonition, remains difficult to definitively identify or verify, with multiple artworks being retroactively claimed as the prophetic piece. A phenomenon that itself demonstrates how our desire for meaningful coincidence can lead us to reshape and reinterpret historical facts to fit a predetermined narrative of destiny, rather than accepting the humbler truth that countless forgotten artworks depicted similar scenes without ever achieving the status of legend. Throughout the history of journalism, there exists a peculiar category of error that straddles the line between administrative oversight and an almost supernatural form of irony, wherein newspapers have published obituaries for individuals who were, at the time of publication, still very much alive. One of the most notable instances of this phenomenon occurred when a major metropolitan newspaper prepared and filed an obituary for a prominent public figure, complete with biographical details, achievements, and reflection on their life's work, only to have this document accidentally released to print several years before the subject's actual death. The obituary had been written as a preparatory measure, a common practice among newsrooms seeking to ensure that important figures receive appropriate coverage upon their passing. Yet the premature publication created a jarring cognitive dissonance for readers encountering what amounted to a detailed account of someone's life presented in the past tense while that person continued living. The individual in question reportedly experienced shock and dark humor upon discovering their own death announced in newsprint, an experience that most people never have the opportunity to witness. The mechanism behind such occurrences reveals something about the nature of modern institutional processes, where preventative documentation becomes so routinized that the distinction between preparation and publication can blur through a simple procedural failure or database error. Archives of pre-written obituaries exist in a liminal space, neither fully public nor private, and the boundary between these states depends entirely on human attention and verification systems that are, despite their importance, still subject to the occasional lapse. What becomes striking is not merely the error itself, but how such incidents expose the uncomfortable reality that we have constructed elaborate systems for documenting and narrating human mortality, systems that function largely invisible to those they describe, operating as though preparing for death has become another standard administrative task rather than something that might warrant exceptional caution and human oversight. These coincidences persist because institutions, by their nature, must function efficiently, and efficiency sometimes means that the processes designed to protect dignity become themselves threats to it. Yet perhaps this is inevitable in an age where the infrastructure of commemoration has become as automated and routinized as any other news operation. The premature obituary serves as a reminder that in systematizing our relationship to mortality, we risk reducing the profundity of a life's end to merely another data management problem awaiting resolution. The most infamous modern example remains that of Associated Press's premature obituary of Apple co-founder Steve Jobs, which circulated briefly in 2008 before his actual death in 2011, a mistake that underscored how even the most technologically sophisticated newsrooms remain vulnerable to the human errors embedded within their systems. Such incidents ultimately reveal that no amount of procedural safeguarding can entirely eliminate the gap between institutional intention and institutional outcome. Throughout history, numerous accounts have documented the peculiar phenomenon of clocks and timepieces stopping at the exact moment a person died, as though the mechanical instrument somehow sensed the departure of life itself and ceased its measured beating in simultaneous recognition. One of the most famous examples involves the death of Abraham Lincoln, where multiple historical records claim that the clock in the White House stopped at the precise moment of his assassination, remaining frozen at that hour for years afterward as a kind of macabre memorial to the tragedy. Similarly, when Charles Dickens suffered his fatal stroke in 1870, witnesses reported that the clock on his mantelpiece had stopped at the exact time of his death, a detail that spread through Victorian society and became embedded in the romantic narrative surrounding the celebrated author's final moments. The phenomenon extends far beyond these famous cases, with countless family records and local histories containing anecdotes of grandfather clocks, pocket watches, and wall-mounted timepieces that inexplicably halted their mechanisms just as a beloved family member passed away, creating an almost supernatural coincidence that seemed to blur the boundary between the mechanical and the metaphysical. The psychological mechanism underlying this widespread belief lies in our profound human need to find meaning and connection in random events, a tendency known as apophenia, wherein our brains unconsciously seek patterns and relationships between occurrences that are actually independent of one another. When a person dies, especially someone close to us, our emotional and cognitive state becomes heightened and acutely observant, making us far more likely to notice details that we might otherwise overlook or forget, such as the exact time displayed on a nearby clock, which then becomes permanently associated with that moment of loss. Additionally, in earlier centuries when mechanical timepieces were less reliable and more prone to stopping due to dust, temperature changes, and mechanical wear, clocks frequently stopped without anyone's knowledge or attention, only to be discovered and suddenly assigned profound significance when death occurred in the household, allowing confirmation bias to solidify the connection between the two events in family memory. Despite our modern understanding of mechanical function and probability, despite our scientific knowledge that clocks stop and start for entirely mundane reasons unrelated to human mortality, the narrative persists in contemporary society, passed down through generations, as a touching reminder of a deeper connection between life and time, between the mechanical beating of gears and the beating of human hearts. Perhaps what makes this belief so enduring is that it offers us a poetic language for grief itself, a way to transform the randomness and cruelty of death into a moment of cosmic acknowledgement, where even the universe's machines pause in respect for a life that has ended. In this way, the stopped clock becomes less a supernatural phenomenon and more a symbol of our refusal to let death be merely biological, a final act of human meaning-making that transforms a machine's mechanical failure into a moment of terrible beauty and inexplicable grace. In the autumn of 1862, a woman named Sarah Whitmore in Yorkshire received a letter from her sister Margaret, who had emigrated to Australia some years prior, and the letter contained intimate details about Margaret's life on the other side of the world, discussing her daily struggles with the harsh climate, her newly born child, and her deepest anxieties about never seeing her family again. Sarah held this letter close to her heart and read it repeatedly over the following weeks, finding solace in the connection it provided across the vast ocean that separated them. 3 months later, Sarah received devastating news through official channels that Margaret had died of complications from childbirth on the exact date that the letter had been written, meaning that, as Sarah was reading her sister's words about her newborn and her hopes for the future, Margaret was simultaneously drawing her final breaths in a colony thousands of miles away. The letter had traveled through the postal systems of multiple countries, taking nearly 4 months to arrive, and in that span of time, the person who had written those words with her own hand had already ceased to exist, yet her thoughts and feelings persisted, arriving at their destination as if summoned from beyond the boundary of death itself. What makes this phenomenon so deeply unsettling is not merely the coincidence of timing, but rather the way our minds process the simultaneous existence and non-existence of the same person, the way we hold a letter in our hands knowing that the consciousness that created it no longer exists anywhere in the physical world. This particular coincidence occurred in an era before telegraph and telephone, when the slow passage of mail across oceans and continents meant that such temporal disruptions were far more common than they are today. Yet we rarely speak about the thousands of letters that arrived after their writers had already died, creating these strange echoes of people who were gone. The mechanism behind our fascination with such events lies in our deep discomfort with death and absence, and the way that written words seem to transcend mortality in ways that other objects do not, carrying intention and personality in a manner that photographs or possessions cannot quite replicate. Even now, in our age of instant communication, we find ourselves drawn to stories of last emails, final messages, and words written just before catastrophe, as though language itself possesses some mysterious power to reach across the boundary between life and death, and we continue to believe, despite all logical reasoning, that words can somehow connect us to those who have already departed. Perhaps this is why we preserve these letters so carefully, why they become sacred objects passed down through generations, their worn envelopes and faded ink transformed into relics that somehow make the dead feel less entirely gone, as though the act of reading their final words might compress time itself and return us, for just a moment, to a world where they still lived and breathed. In this way, Sarah Whitmore's letter from Margaret became more than mere correspondence. It transformed into a conversation that transcended the limitations of time itself, a final gift that arrived not despite Margaret's death, but perhaps because of it, carrying weight that no living letter could ever possess.